Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. I didn't have anyone to spend Christmas with this year, no wife, no kids, and I hadn't spoken to my family in years. So I figured I'd make the best of it and rented a cabin deep in the Appalachians. I thought some solitude might do me good. No city noise, no people, just snow-covered woods and a fire. I got there Christmas Eve, just before sunset. The place was simple, small living room, a wood stove, and a big window looking out onto the pines. It felt peaceful. I even caught myself smiling as I built a fire and settled in with a drink. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked some dinner, stared into the fire, and tried to enjoy the quiet. Around 9 p.m. I stepped out onto the porch for a cigarette. The snow was falling steadily, muffling the world around me. It was almost too quiet. No wind, no animals, just this heavy silence. That's when I noticed it. Something moved between the trees, about 50 yards out. At first I thought it was a deer, but it was too tall. It moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trunks like it was watching me. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My gut told me it wasn't right, but my brain fought back with reason. Maybe it was just a shadow, or a trick of the light. I crushed my cigarette and went back inside, bolting the door behind me. I tried to shake the unease, but it lingered. The cabin, which had felt cozy an hour ago, now felt stifling. The big window seemed too exposed, like something or someone could be watching. I didn't sleep. I sat there by the fire until dawn, poker in hand, heart racing at every creak or gust of wind. When daylight finally came, I worked up the nerve to look outside. The porch was empty, but the snow told a different story. Footprints led from the tree line to the porch. They weren't human. The toes were too long, the shape too strange, and they circled the cabin, stopping by the window where I'd been sleeping. I didn't wait to figure out what made them. I packed my bag, threw on my coat, and got out of there as fast as my car could handle the icy road. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll tell you this, I won't ever spend Christmas alone in the woods again. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. I've lived alone in a remote mountain cabin for years, surrounded by dense forest and snow, and never once felt uneasy until last winter. It started after I returned from setting trap lines deep in the woods and noticed massive clawed tracks circling the cabin. They were larger than anything I'd ever seen and spaced strangely, not like any bear or animal I could name. But I brushed it off as a predator passing through and locked the door as usual, pushing a heavy dresser in front of it, just in case. That night, as the wind howled, I was nearly asleep when I heard heavy, deliberate thumps outside, moving in a slow rhythm. At first I thought it might be the old wood creaking in the cold, but then came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across the walls. The sound circled the cabin, methodical, stopping at the window nearest my bed. I didn't dare move, my heart pounding, and when 3 deliberate knocks echoed on the glass, knock, 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 I grabbed the rifle beside my bed and sat frozen in place. The sound stopped, and I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to even check outside. The next morning, I finally stepped out to investigate and found long scratches scored into the wood of the cabin walls. The tracks in the snow were back, circling the house in tight loops, but vanishing abruptly in the middle of the yard, as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. Still I stayed. That night, I built the fire high, hoping it would keep anything away, and sat with my rifle in my lap. For hours, the forest was silent, and I began to convince myself it had all been in my head. Then, close to midnight, I heard it, a low, haunting whistle drifting through the trees. It didn't sound like the wind or any animal I knew. It was deliberate, almost human. I stood up, my pulse racing, and peered out the window. The yard was empty, the snow untouched, but the whistle came again, sharper this time, from the opposite side of the cabin. I turned to follow the sound, and in the shadows of the tree-line, I saw it, a flicker of movement, something big, ducking out of sight. It wasn't an animal. It didn't move like one. It moved like it was watching me. The sound stopped, but I stayed awake all night, rifle in hand, every nerve on edge. By dawn, fresh tracks had appeared, circling the cabin again. This time, on the porch just outside my door, there was something else, a pile of sticks arranged into a crude, human-like shape. My chest tightened, and without hesitation, I packed my things and left. I drove until the snow turned to pavement, not stopping until I reached the safety of town. I haven't been back to the cabin since. People here laughed it off, said it must have been wolves, a bear, or even my imagination, but I know better. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal, and sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through the trees, I still hear that sound low, haunting, and deliberate. I know it's still out there waiting. Last winter break, I picked up work delivering food for DoorDash. It's the easiest way to make quick cash without interviews or training. College was out for the month, and I needed enough money to hold me over until spring semester. My dad let me borrow his old pickup truck, which was better suited for snowy roads than my beat-up little sedan. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas, and the snow had been falling steadily all day. Most people were hunkered down at home, which worked in my favor. I was getting constant orders, and the tips were generous. I'd been at it for hours when one last order popped up around 11 p.m. The pickup was from a nearby KFC, and the delivery address was about 20 minutes away. The payout was solid, so I accepted it. The map showed the house was tucked inside one of those older, wealthier neighborhoods across the county. The kind with sprawling yards, tall iron gates, and houses set far back from the road. I'd driven past the area before, but never delivered inside. The snow had really started to pile up by the time I reached the neighborhood. The streetlights glowed dimly through the thick flakes, and most houses were dark, their owners likely asleep. As I made my way through the winding streets, I couldn't help but notice how eerie it felt. Huge homes, spaced far apart, completely silent under the weight of snow. When I reached the delivery address, I realized the driveway hadn't been plowed at all. There was at least a foot of snow blocking the path, so I parked along the curb and started trudging up to the house with the bag of food clutched in my hand. Snow immediately began soaking into my shoes and jeans, and I muttered curses under my breath. The house was enormous, but completely dark, not a single light on. As I reached the front door, I noticed a piece of paper taped to it. In bold red letters at the top, it said "Notice." Below there was text from the county about the property, but before I could read further, I heard a sound behind me, the crunch of boots and snow. I turned around and saw a man emerging from the side of the garage. He was wearing a dirty, oversized jacket, and his hair was buzzed short. His face was pale, and his eyes, something about them felt hollow, sunken. "Just dropping off your order," I said, holding out the bag toward him. He didn't respond. He just walked up to me slowly, hand extended, until I placed the food in his grasp. But instead of turning back toward the house, he just stood there, staring at me. Seconds passed, and my stomach knotted tighter with each one. Why wasn't he going inside? Why had he even come from around the garage instead of the front door? "All right, have a good night, sir," I said, trying to sound casual. I stepped sideways into the snow, attempting to pass him. That's when he lunged. His hand swiped toward my arm, fingers outstretched, but I stumbled back just in time. His voice came low and sharp as he said, "Come with me." My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned and bolted down the driveway. The snow made every step sluggish, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me I heard him shouting, "Stop running." His boots crunched closer and closer in the snow. Somehow I reached the truck, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut just as he reached the tailgate. I shoved the keys into the ignition, reversed out of the snowbank with my tires spinning and screeching, and sped away from the house. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the edge of the driveway, barely illuminated by the truck's taillights. He wasn't chasing anymore, he was just watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station a few miles away. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial 911. I told the dispatcher everything, every detail I could remember. The police called me back a few hours later with an update. The house wasn't occupied. It had been foreclosed months ago and was currently listed as vacant. Whatever the paper on the door said was probably related to that, but the man, they didn't know who he was or where he'd gone. Even now, months later, I can't pull up to a darkened house for a delivery without feeling that same cold dread crawl up my spine. I always catch myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that pale face and hollow eyes staring back at me from the dark. It gets lonely out here in the winter. It always has, but that's how I like it. The cabin I live in is a small, crooked structure my grandfather built years before I was born. It sits at the edge of a thick forest, miles away from the nearest town, where the snow falls so heavy it drowns out every sound except your own breathing. Out here, silence isn't peaceful, it's absolute. It's hunting's my life, deer mostly. Keeps the freezer full, and the routine keeps me sane. Up before dawn, rifles slung over my shoulder, and a day spent moving slow through trees I know better than the back of my hand. I don't mind the isolation. Most days, it feels like I'm the only thing alive for miles, but last winter, that winter was different. It had snowed heavy the night before, so the ground was soft and pristine when I stepped outside at sunrise, boots sinking with every step. I was heading to my usual trail when I saw them prints leading up to my cabin. Large prints. Bear. Now, I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, but these were strange. The spacing was wrong, too close together, like whatever made them wasn't walking right. And they didn't trail off back into the woods, they just stopped, 10 feet from my porch. I stopped, too, my breath fogging up in front of me as I scanned the trees. Nothing. Just the weight of the woods staring back at me, quiet as the grave. My hand tightened on the rifle. Black bears were common enough, but one coming this close to the cabin, in the dead of winter? It didn't sit right. I shook it off and set out. The day went slow, and I didn't see a damn thing. Not a rabbit. Not a bird. Even the forest felt off too still. The air was heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something there. Watching. By mid-afternoon I gave up and turned back for home. That's when I saw it. A deer, half hidden behind a cluster of pines. It was standing still, too still. Its head turned toward me. I froze, raising my rifle, but something made me hesitate. Its body was thin, almost unnatural. Its legs longer than they should have been. Its head tilted slightly to the side like it was studying me. I lowered the gun, my chest felt tight. It let out a sound low and guttural, like a growl, but deer don't growl. I blinked, and before I could process what I'd just heard, it bolted, its movement jerky and awkward, vanishing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, rifle limp in my hands, before I finally forced myself to move. That night, I locked every door and window in the cabin. The tracks were still out there, I could feel it. I stoked the fire higher than usual, and sat at the table, listening. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe the sound of branches snapping or claws scraping against the walls. Nothing came. I don't remember falling asleep, but something woke me in the dark. A noise outside. Scraping. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The fire was low, just flickering coals now, and the cabin felt impossibly cold. I strained my ears, listening. There it was again. A slow dragging scrape against the front door. Just a bear, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. A bear looking for food. But I didn't believe it. I grabbed the rifle, my hands slick with sweat, and stood. The scraping stopped. Silence again, but this time it felt alive. I could hear something breathing slow, heavy breaths just on the other side of the wood. I took a step closer to the door, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and that's when I heard it. Deep, slow, human-like panting and grunting, sounding like an exhausted man on the other side. Broken up by a whisper, it sounded something like, "Let me in." I couldn't quite make it out, the blood drained from my face. I backed away from the door, rifle trembling in my grip. "Get out of here," I shouted. But the voice came again, much louder this time, mimicking me. "Get out of here." The scraping resumed. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair and scrambled toward the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I dropped to the floor, aiming the rifle at the doorway, and waited. The scraping stopped again. And then nothing. Minutes dragged into hours. I didn't move, barely breathed. My eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. The cabin was silent again, except for my heartbeat thudding in my ears. My rational mind said it was an animal and a junkie lost in the forest on some sort of drug, but I couldn't help but feel that it was something unnatural. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Before Callie and I officially started dating, we spent a lot of time together. We both loved hiking, and her family owned a rustic cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine near a quiet little ski resort. She invited me up there one weekend in February, our first proper trip together. The drive was long, about 6 hours, and the last hour was spent winding up narrow snow-covered roads with thick pines pressing in from both sides. We passed a handful of driveways, most leading into shadowy woods, their tire tracks buried under fresh snow. Callie explained that most of these places belonged to out-of-state owners who only visited in the summer. When we finally reached the cabin, it was almost dark. The place was small and charming, with smoke curling from the chimney and a heavy blanket of snow softening every edge. Inside was warm and cozy, though it was clear the place was old, mismatched furniture, and no running water. Callie pointed out an outhouse tucked behind some trees for when nature called. That first night, we cooked pasta on the wood stove and watched a movie on her laptop. The only light came from the soft glow of the screen and the flickering fire. At some point, I stepped outside to use the outhouse. The snow was falling thick and fast, and the woods around me felt impossibly still. The next morning I noticed something strange as I trudged back to the outhouse, footprints in the snow. They were large, not animal prints, but wide boot marks. The trail led from the edge of the woods to the cabin, then circled around to the back. I called Callie outside, and she frowned as she examined the prints. Probably just some hunter or hiker, she said, but even as she said it, I could tell she didn't entirely believe it. We spent the day snowboarding at the resort. It was perfect. Clear skies, powdery snow, and hardly any other skiers. On our way back, we stopped at a diner and grabbed burgers and hot chocolate. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the sun had long disappeared and the woods were swallowed by pitch-black night. Inside, we cranked up the heat, started a fire, and opened a couple of beers. Callie played music on her phone while we sprawled on the couch, warm and drowsy from the day's adventure. Eventually, I needed to use the outhouse again. I bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the freezing night. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the beam of my light, and everything was deathly quiet. As I sat in the outhouse, the faint sound of crunching snow reached my ears. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart froze. Callie, I called out softly, no reply. The footsteps stopped. Then they resumed, moving away from the outhouse, back towards the cabin. I texted Callie, "Are you outside?" But there was no signal. After what felt like an eternity, I finished up and hurried back to the cabin. But as I approached, something felt wrong. The lights inside were out, and the music had stopped. I followed a fresh set of footprints in the snow to the front door, my breath sharp in the freezing air. Before I could knock, the door flew open, and Callie yanked me inside. She slammed the door, locked it, and whispered, her voice shaking. There was someone out there. They tried to open the door. I thought it was you, but when I saw their face in the window, she trailed off, eyes wide with fear. Callie showed me a hatch in the floor, her dad's hidden storage. Inside were a few hunting rifles. I grabbed one, loaded it, and sat on the couch with her in complete darkness, the cold creeping in around us. We waited. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Just the wind against the walls and the faint patter of snow on the roof. Then the sound came again. Footsteps circling the cabin. I jumped up, flung the front door open, and fired 3 shots into the air. My voice was raw as I screamed into the night. "Get out of here!" The footsteps stopped, silence returned, thick and suffocating. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, we packed our things and left, following Callie's dad's advice to get out as soon as it was light. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin. Snow had covered most of the footprints, but I could still see faint tracks leading into the woods, deeper and deeper, until they vanished into the trees. We never went back to that cabin. Callie's family put it up for sale later that year, and part of me hopes whoever owns it now never has to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow. It had been 3 weeks since Michael and I broke up, just as December was settling into its bitter cold. The breakup wasn't dramatic, just the kind of slow fizzling out that left me feeling empty. Christmas Eve only made it worse. My friends were busy with their own families, and the thought of spending another night alone in my tiny apartment was unbearable. After half a bottle of wine and a lot of second-guessing, I re-downloaded Tinder. The profiles were the usual mixed guys holding fish, gym mirror selfies, weird bios about not looking for anything serious. But then I saw him, James. His profile picture was of him at an ice rink, smiling, dark hair falling into his eyes. His bio was charming in a simple way. New in town, looking for good food and better company. It felt refreshing compared to everything else, so I swiped right. Within minutes, we matched. He messaged me first something about how my photo looked cozy, which made me laugh. The conversation was easy, natural, and before I knew it, he asked if I'd like to grab dinner the next evening, Christmas Day. I hesitated. Meeting a stranger on Christmas felt odd, but I reminded myself that I had no other plans. What's the harm in dinner? The next day, we met at a little Italian place near the edge of town. He looked even better in person, tall, broad shoulders, with an easy smile that made me relax almost instantly. Over dinner, we talked about everything. The cities we'd lived in, our favorite Christmas memories, even the cringy Hallmark movies we both secretly loved. It felt like a movie itself, 2 strangers finding each other on Christmas. Afterward, he suggested we head to an ice skating rink nearby. It had been years since I'd skated, but the idea sounded fun, and I didn't want the night to end. The rink was small and crowded with families and couples, the air cold enough to bite, but somehow comforting under the glow of twinkling Christmas lights. James was good at skating, gliding effortlessly while I clung to the edge, laughing at myself. After a while, he grabbed my hands and pulled me into the middle of the rink. I stumbled, nearly falling, but he caught me, his grip firm but gentle. "You're getting better," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "I'm terrible, and you know it." He laughed, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. After the rink, James invited me back to his place for a drink. I hesitated, but the night had been so perfect, and he seemed kind, so I said yes. His apartment was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of pine, like he'd lit a Christmas candle earlier. We sat on the couch, sipping wine and talking more. I only had one glass, not enough to make me drunk, but I felt off. It was subtle at first, a lightheadedness that I chalked up to the skating and the cold, but then my limbs started to feel heavy, my thoughts muddled. James was talking, but his words felt distant, like they were coming through water. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, but even that felt like a struggle. My memory blurred after that. I remembered him helping me to my feet, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then darkness. I woke up the next morning in a freezing, empty car park. My head throbbed, my body aching as I sat up on the cold concrete. I was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, but my coat was gone, and my phone was dead. Panic set in as I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I could remember was James' apartment. Somehow, I managed to get home. My front door was locked, but something felt wrong. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, and when I checked my bedroom, I found my drawers slightly open, as if someone had rifled through them. My stomach twisted. I called the police. The investigation moved quickly at first. The officers asked me about James, about where he lived, and what I remembered. When I described his apartment, they exchanged a glance. "There's no apartment there," one of them said. "That building's been abandoned for months." My blood ran cold. A few hours later, they found James. His body was discovered in a frozen lake just outside of town. The news was almost too much to process. The officers said it looked like suicide. They believed he panicked after drugging me, perhaps realizing I might report him. His car was parked nearby, but there were no other clues. Weeks have passed since that night, but I can't stop replaying it in my head. The police think the case is closed, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear faint footsteps outside my window, or the soft scrape of something against my door. The locks have all been changed, but it doesn't make me feel safer. I keep wondering why he left me in that car park instead of doing something worse. Why go through my house? Why leave me alive? I don't have answers. Just this gnawing unease that I can't shake. And every time I think about him, I remember his hands on mine at the skating rink, pulling me into the middle of the ice, and the way he smiled like he already knew how the night would end. Winter storms in Alaska aren't unusual. Most of us here know how to handle heavy snow, even when it comes down in thick, blinding sheets. I've been living alone in this modest cabin for about 5 years now. It's nestled at the edge of the woods, far enough from town to enjoy the quiet, but close enough that the drive doesn't feel like an expedition. That night, though, something felt different. It was late December 2017, a Friday. I'd closed up my store early, told my staff to get home before the roads became impassable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the snow was already piling up, swallowing the outlines of my property. I shoveled just enough to park, went inside, locked up, and turned on the heater. The wind howled, rattling the old window panes, but the sound was oddly comforting. I made cocoa, settled into my recliner, the kind that leans too far back if you're not careful, and put on a documentary about glaciers. It was shaping up to be one of those quiet, cozy nights I'd grown to cherish. But then, around midnight, there was a knock. I froze mid-sip, staring at the front door. Visitors out here, especially at this hour and during a storm, weren't common. I set my mug down and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside just a fraction. The snow outside blurred everything under the dim porch light, but something caught my eye. Boot prints. Fresh ones. They led up to my door and back down the steps. Whoever it was had knocked, then left. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the deadbolt. There was no way I was opening that door. The prints were sharp, edged, no snow had filled them in yet. They were fresh. I stayed there until my breath fogged up the glass, then locked the door again and forced myself back to my recliner. An hour later, the second knock came. This time, it was from the side of the house, right near the kitchen window. My stomach knotted as I grabbed the flashlight I kept near the door. The kitchen window was frosted over, obscuring my view, but I could tell. The snow beneath it was untouched. No tracks. No sign of anyone. But the knock had been real. I flicked off the kitchen light, scanning the yard with my flashlight beam. Snowflakes danced in the light, swirling violently in the wind. But there was nothing else. After a while, I convinced myself it had been a branch. Or maybe even just the storm playing tricks. But deep down I knew better. I triple-checked every window and lock before heading to bed, flashlight still clutched in my hand. The third knock woke me just before 3 a.m. This one was loud and sharp, coming from the sliding glass door that led to my deck. I sat up, my ears straining over the wind's howl. Slowly, I crept down the hallway, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sliding door was locked. I'd made sure of it earlier. But the curtain was open. Beyond the glass, the deck was covered in pristine snow. No tracks. No footprints. But the knocks had been real. For the rest of the night, they didn't stop. Every hour, a knock would come from the front door, the back deck, the side window. It was as if someone was circling my house, methodically tapping at each entrance. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching in the snow. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the storm. There was no way I was stepping outside. Not in that blizzard. And certainly not when something was out there. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every light on. The flashlight shaking slightly in my hands. When dawn finally came, the storm had eased, leaving a pale, overcast sky. The silence outside felt deafening. I bundled up in my thickest coat and stepped outside, my boots sinking deep into the snow. At first, everything looked normal. But as I walked around the cabin, I began to notice them. Footprints. They circled my house, weaving between windows and doors, stopping at every entrance. Whoever had made them had walked the perimeter several times. But what unsettled me most was where the tracks led. At the edge of my property, they merged with something else. Tire tracks. A snowmobile. The faint imprint of its tread curved away into the woods. I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of snow. The tracks weren't fresh. Snowfall had started to bury them, meaning whoever had been out there had left just before dawn. They had planned this. I stared at the tracks disappearing into the tree line, debating whether to follow them. But the snowmobile's trail was already fading, and I wasn't about to trek into the frozen woods alone. When I got back to the house, I called the police. 2 officers arrived, one young, one older. The younger guy looked skeptical, but when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks, his expression changed. The older officer didn't even hesitate. Not a lot of kids riding snowmobiles during a blizzard at night, he said. They followed the tracks briefly, but returned after 15 minutes. The snow had all but erased them. Whoever it was, the older officer said, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. What do you think they wanted? I asked. He hesitated. Could have been someone looking for shelter. Or maybe they just wanted to scare you, but the way he said it, I could tell he didn't believe that either. After they left, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints circling my home. The snowmobile waiting just beyond the trees. Whoever it was, they had been deliberate. They had known exactly what they were doing. By mid-afternoon, I made a decision. I drove into town, straight to the nearest gun store. I'd never owned a firearm before, but that day, I left with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel prepared. The clerk's parting words echoed in my head on the drive home. Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. That night, I slept with the handgun on my nightstand and the rifle propped by the front door. I wasn't going to let fear turn my home into a prison. I still love the stillness of winter storms, the way they blanket the world in quiet. But now, I see them differently. They're not just peaceful, they're a veil. A cover for someone lurking just beyond the edge of the tree line. And if they ever come back, I'll be ready this time. It was Christmas Eve, and I was where I always ended up during the holidays. Alone. I'd rented a cabin deep in the mountains, hoping for peace and quiet. No family, no friends, no cheerful carols or awkward gatherings. Just the woods, the snow, and the kind of silence that lets you forget the world exists. The cabin was perfect. Small, cozy, surrounded by dense pine forest. The only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots when I arrived, and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, not even a TV. Just a wood-burning stove, a creaky bed, and a single window looking out over the clearing. I unpacked my things, got a fire going, and settled into the quiet. For the first few hours, it was everything I wanted. I made a cup of coffee, sat by the stove, and stared out at the snow piling up outside. The forest was beautiful in its stillness. The kind of deep quiet you can only find far from people. It wasn't until I stepped outside to grab more firewood that I first noticed something odd. The clearing around the cabin wasn't big, maybe 50 feet across before the trees started, but it gave me just enough of a view to see the faint outlines of the forest beyond. As I bent to pick up the logs, I saw something standing between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a deer, and completely still. I froze, clutching the firewood, and squinted into the shadows. The light was fading fast, but I could just make out the shape standing between two pines. It didn't move. "Hello," I called, my voice sharper than I intended. No response. The wood swallowed my words, leaving only the faint hiss of wind through the trees. I stepped closer to the cabin, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure still didn't move. It was just standing there watching. I told myself it was nothing, a shadow, a trick of the light, but my gut said otherwise. I backed into the cabin, bolted the door, and locked the shutters on the window. My heart was racing, but I told myself to get a grip. It was nothing, just nerves. I poured a drink, sat by the fire, and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around midnight when I heard it, a faint crunching sound coming from outside. I sat up, the blanket falling from my shoulders. At first I thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too deliberate. Heavy, steady steps. Something or someone was walking around the cabin. I grabbed the fire poker and crept to the window. The shutters were still closed, but I peeked through the narrow gap between them, holding my breath. The clearing was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and steady, crunching softly in the snow. My throat tightened. I wanted to call out, but something told me not to. Instead, I stayed frozen by the window, listening. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding, but the silence stretched on. Just as I started to relax, a new sound cut through the quiet. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I backed away, clutching the fire poker. The tapping was soft but insistent, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but there was only silence. After a long moment, I forced myself to look through the gap in the shutters again. The clearing was still empty. I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove, staring at the door, the poker still in my hand. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, I finally mustered the courage to step outside. The snow had stopped, and the forest was bathed in pale morning light. The clearing was still untouched except for the tracks. Footprints circled the cabin, over and over, close to the walls. They weren't animal tracks. They were long, narrow, and deep, like someone had walked barefoot through the snow. They led to the window, where they stopped. I followed them around the cabin, my breath clouding in the cold air. The tracks stayed close to the walls, circling again and again, as if whatever had made them was pacing. Then they disappeared. They didn't lead to the forest. They didn't trail off into the distance. They just stopped. The snow beyond the clearing was untouched, pristine. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my skin crawling. I don't know what was out there that night. All I know is that I won't be coming back. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. It was a bitterly cold winter night, the kind where the chill seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital. The roads almost deserted, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that glistened under the dim streetlights. My car's heater was working overtime, but I still felt the cold creeping in, a relentless reminder of the harshness outside. I'd taken this route 100 times, a winding back road that cut through a dense forest, its tall pines looming over the narrow path like silent sentinels. Tonight, however, the usual tranquility felt oppressive. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. My headlights pierced through the blackness, illuminating only the immediate stretch of road ahead. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, my headlights caught a glint of something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, common enough in these parts. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car. It was an old, battered sedan, half buried in the snowbank, its front end crumpled against a tree. I slowed down, my heart rate quickening. There were no other cars around, no sign of anyone else. I pulled over, the crunch of my tires on the snow loud in the stillness. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, stepping out into the freezing air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of unease. I approached the car cautiously, shining my light inside. The driver's seat was empty, but the airbags had deployed, and there was a dark stain on the fabric that made my stomach churn. I circled around to the passenger side, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest. I felt a pang of dread. Whoever had been driving was nowhere to be seen, and in this cold, that was a bad sign. I debated calling for help, but decided to check the surrounding area first. Maybe they had wandered off, dazed and injured. My breath puffed out in white clouds as I ventured further from the road, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I'd gone maybe 50 yards when I saw it footprints in the snow. They were uneven, like whoever made them was struggling. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was deathly quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow under my boots. The footprints led me deeper into the woods, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. If they were hurt, they wouldn't last long in these conditions. Suddenly I heard a noise, a faint rustling ahead of me. I quickened my pace, calling out again, "Hello? Are you there?" The rustling stopped, replaced by a low, pained moan. I broke into a run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. As I rounded a cluster of trees, I saw them. A figure huddled against a fallen log, their clothes torn and bloodied. I knelt beside them. A man, his face pale and lips blue from the cold. His eyes fluttered open, filled with a mix of fear and relief. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 and relaying our location as best as I could. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but out here it would take time. I did what I could to keep him warm, wrapping him in my coat and talking to him to keep him conscious. His name was Tom, and he'd swerved to avoid a deer, crashing into the tree. He'd tried to walk for help but collapsed from the cold and his injuries. I stayed with him, the minutes dragging on, my own fear mounting. The darkness seemed to press in around us, the cold gnawing at my extremities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through the trees. The paramedics arrived, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to my frantic worry. They bundled Tom onto a stretcher, reassuring me he would be all right. As they loaded him into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to me. "You did good," she said, her breath misting in the cold air. "You probably saved his life." I watched as the ambulance drove away, the red taillights disappearing into the night. I was left standing there, alone in the silent forest, the adrenaline slowly fading. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a wave. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the realization of how close it had been. I made my way back to my car, my mind replaying the night's events. As I drove home, the snow-covered road stretching endlessly before me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, a silent witness to the night's harrowing events. I vowed to take the main road from now on, leaving this desolate path to its dark, wintry solitude. Driving along the Oregon coast in late November is usually breathtaking. The endless stretch of ocean to one side, dense evergreen forests pressing in on the other, and mist hanging low like some kind of veil. That's why I was out there, camera bag riding shotgun, and a thermos of coffee tucked into the cup holder. Photography had always been my escape, and a storm was rolling in over the Pacific. The moody skies and churning waves would make for some incredible shots. The forecast had warned of heavy rain and strong winds, but I'd been through worse. I followed a winding two-lane road that hugged the cliffs, occasionally stopping at overlooks to set up my tripod. Late in the afternoon, as the clouds thickened and the light began to fade, I noticed a narrow gravel road branching off towards what looked like an old, abandoned viewpoint. It wasn't on my map, but the angle overlooking the ocean looked promising. I turned onto the path, tires crunching over wet gravel. The road snaked downward into a secluded clearing with an old picnic table and a crumbling stone barrier overlooking the sea. I parked and stepped out into the salt-tinged air. The wind was picking up, and fat raindrops were already starting to fall. I managed to capture a few shots, dark waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks below, before the rain became too heavy to keep my lens dry. Back in the car, I realized my mistake. The gravel path had turned muddy under the relentless rain. As I tried to back up, my wheels spun uselessly. I was stuck. "All right," I muttered, gripping the wheel. "Stay calm." My phone had no signal, not surprising out here. I had supplies, a full tank of gas, snacks, a blanket, and a rain poncho. Worst case, I'd wait out the storm. An hour later, just as darkness was swallowing the coastline, I noticed headlights approaching from the main road. Relief washed over me as a large, weather-beaten pickup truck rolled into the clearing. It came to a stop a few feet away, and a man climbed out. He was wearing a heavy raincoat, hood pulled low over his face. "You stuck?" he called over the roar of the wind. I cracked my window just an inch. "Yeah, wheels are spinning in the mud. Do you have a tow rope?" He stepped closer, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Tow rope won't do much good on this slick ground. You'd be better off coming with me back to town. I can drop you at a motel." There was something in his voice, steady, flat, and just a little too casual, that made me hesitate. His posture, the way he was half turned towards his truck as if blocking my view, didn't feel right either. "I think I'll stay here for now," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "I've got supplies. I'll wait it out." The man didn't move. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his hood, his face obscured by shadows. "Storm's getting worse," he said softly. "You sure you want to be out here all night?" I forced a smile. "I'll be fine, really. Thanks for stopping, though." There was a long silence before he gave a single nod and turned back toward his truck. But he didn't leave. Instead of driving off, he walked slowly around the front of my car, his hand trailing lightly across the hood. It wasn't a casual glance or a mechanic's inspection. It felt deliberate, like he was marking something. I locked my doors and watched him through the side mirror. When he finally got back into his truck, I let out a shaky breath. But the relief was short-lived. The truck didn't leave. Its headlights stayed on, illuminating my rearview mirror with blinding white light. The engine idled, and every so often I'd hear it rev slightly, as if he was testing the gas pedal. I turned off my interior lights and sank low in my seat, clutching my phone even though it was useless without service. I debated running, but where would I go? The rain was torrential, and I had no idea how far I'd have to walk to find help. The truck stayed there for what felt like hours. My eyes burned from staring at the mirror, from the strain of waiting, of trying to figure out what his next move would be. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the truck's engine roared, and it backed out of the clearing. The red glow of taillights faded into the dark storm. But I wasn't relieved, not yet. I stayed in my car until the first light of dawn broke through the thinning clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving the clearing a swampy mess. I climbed out and inspected the area around my car. That's when I saw them. Footprints, clear, deep impressions in the mud circled my car. He had walked around it multiple times, stopping at each window, each door. I swallowed hard and scanned the woods, half expecting to see him still standing there, watching me. I didn't waste any more time. I managed to wedge rocks and sticks under my tires for traction, and freed my car from the mud. I didn't stop until I reached a diner back on the main highway. The waitress noticed how shaken I looked and asked what had happened. I told her everything. The truck. The man. The way he had circled my car and stayed there all night. Her face went pale. "You're lucky," she said softly. "There have been stories about a truck like that. Drivers stranded on back roads, approached by a man offering rides. But the people who accept, they don't always come back." I gripped my coffee cup, my hands trembling. I haven't stopped exploring remote places, and I still chase storms for the perfect shot. But now I travel with a satellite phone, emergency flares, and extra precautions. Because out there, on lonely back roads and under heavy storm clouds, the most dangerous thing isn't the weather. It's the people who know how to hide within it. It was early December, and the first real snowstorm of the season had rolled in. I had the day off and spent it huddled in my little cabin in the woods, the fire crackling and the wind howling against the windows. I kept the TV on low, cycling through news updates that warned of heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures worsening overnight. By dusk, the world outside was completely white, and the sharp whistle of the wind sent an occasional shiver down my spine. Around 7 p.m., I pulled a heavy quilt over my shoulders and settled onto the couch with a mug of tea. The storm outside had escalated to a full-on blizzard, and visibility was almost non-existent. I remember glancing toward the sliding glass doors that led to my back porch. Through the distorted swirls of snow, I noticed something, or someone, moving at the edge of my property. It was a figure walking slowly but deliberately through the snow. The woods backed right up to my yard, and no one had any business being out there in weather like this. The figure disappeared into the thick curtain of snow, and despite the fire and blanket, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft raps, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to draw too much attention. I hesitated for a long moment before cautiously walking over and peeking through the peephole. There stood a man, bundled in a heavy brown coat with a scarf wrapped around most of his face. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his skin was pale, almost bluish. When he saw me looking, he gave a faint smile and raised a trembling hand in a weak wave. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about a mile back. I just need somewhere to warm up for a few minutes." There's an instinct buried deep in most of us that whispers when something feels off. It was screaming at me then. "I can't let you in," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "But I can bring you a blanket or some hot tea if you'd like to wait on the porch." The man's smile faltered. He nodded slowly, stepping to the side to sit down on the porch swing. I shut the door, locked it, and hurried to the closet to grab an old blanket. As I returned to the door, blanket in hand, something made me stop. I don't know if it was a sound or just a deep, unshakable feeling, but I paused just before unlocking the deadbolt and leaned to look through the peephole again. The man wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing right at the door, so close that his breath fogged up the glass. One of his hands was on the doorknob, fingers twitching slightly as if testing to see if it would turn. I took several steps back, clutching my phone in one hand as I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered, and I explained in a whisper what was happening. As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on the door, but when I glanced through the peephole again, he was gone. The porch was empty, and the snow on the steps was undisturbed, almost as if no one had ever been there at all. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They checked around the cabin and the surrounding woods, but didn't find any footprints, tire tracks, or any other evidence of someone having been there. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a drifter trying his luck and leaving when he realized help wasn't coming. But I can't shake the feeling that the man hadn't been planning to leave at all. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house and kept the fire burning until dawn. I never saw the man again, but every winter when the first snowstorm rolls in, I find myself glancing at the porch, half expecting to see him standing there, hand on the doorknob waiting. When you spend most of your days surrounded by the sound of heavy machinery and the constant buzz of conversation on construction sites, you start to crave silence. Don't get me wrong, I love my job, building homes from the ground up with my crew, but every once in a while I need to step away from the noise, both literal and figurative. That's why a few winters ago, I booked a remote lodge out in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a place far from city lights where snow blankets the world and silence becomes something you can almost touch. A storm was in the forecast, but honestly, that made it all the more appealing. A warm lodge, a roaring fireplace, and snow piling up outside? Perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was already bruised with heavy clouds, and snowflakes had started their lazy descent. The driveway leading to the lodge was buried under inches of untouched snow, so I had to park down by the main road and haul my bags uphill. The lodge itself was stunning, rustic yet well-kept, perched on a small ridge overlooking a valley. A key was left in a lockbox by the door. Stepping inside, though, I noticed something odd. It was colder than I expected. The heating system was running, but faintly, like it had been left on a low setting for days. I shrugged it off, dropped my bags, and went to start a fire in the old stone fireplace. That's when I noticed the second odd thing: dirty dishes piled in the sink, a couple of mugs, a plate, and a greasy frying pan. Maybe the cleaning crew was in a rush, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. After washing them quickly, I moved on. But the weirdness didn't stop. When I went to unpack in the bedroom, I noticed the bed looked lived in. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow slightly indented. I pressed my hand against the mattress. It was warm. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the heating vents were positioned just right. Maybe it was just residual warmth. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside, cooked myself dinner, poured a generous glass of whiskey, and settled by the fire with an old paperback. Outside, the storm began to rage. Snow lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the pines. It was around midnight when I heard it. A faint creak. At first I brushed it off. It's an old lodge, after all. Wood expands, things shift, houses settle. But then there was another sound, softer this time, almost like a footstep. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and walked through the darkened rooms. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. Outside, the snow was smooth and unbroken. No footprints. I convinced myself it was the wind or a tree branch scraping against the siding. Eventually, I went back to bed, though sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered valley. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, letting the cold air clear the fog in my head. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They started at the back door, sharp and distinct in the fresh snow. They led away from the lodge and into the forest beyond. My stomach twisted. I set my mug down and followed the prints around the side of the building. They weren't random. They moved deliberately, circling the structure, stopping at windows, at doors. And then it hit me. Whoever had made those tracks hadn't approached during the night. They had left. The noises I'd heard. The dirty dishes. The warm bed. They hadn't been leftovers from a sloppy cleaning crew. Someone had been hiding in the lodge when I arrived. They'd waited until I was asleep to slip out into the storm. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks disappearing into the woods. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. I called the property manager immediately. Their apology was almost frantic, stammered out between excuses and reassurances. No one should have been there, they said. The place was supposed to be empty for weeks. Then the woman on the phone added something else, hesitating first. The doors. They all have heavy manual locks on the inside. They can't be opened from the outside, not without a key. Just lock them all before you go to bed tonight, okay? It wasn't comforting, not in the slightest. Still, I spent the rest of the afternoon securing every window, every door. The lodge was old, but those locks were sturdy, industrial grade, the kind you'd expect in a bank vault rather than a vacation rental. That night the wind picked up again. Snowflakes tapped against the glass like tiny fingertips, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. I sat by the window, a hunting knife on the table beside me, and my flashlight within arm's reach. I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind had me snapping my head up, eyes locked on the shadows shifting across the floor. By sunrise, I'd had enough. I packed my bags, double-checked the locks, and left without calling the property manager again. As I drove down the winding mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. That weekend changed something in me. Now whenever I rent a cabin, a lodge, or any remote getaway, I inspect every corner, every closet, every attic hatch. I double-check every lock, every window latch. Because the truth is, in these isolated places where you expect peace and solitude, you're never really as alone as you think you are. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't knowing someone could be out there, it's realizing they already were. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone brushing against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera, just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step, thud. Louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops. To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house. Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before, but something was off, faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me in the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing, one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone brushing against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera, just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step. Thud. Louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops? To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house. Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before. But something was off, faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was a trick of the wind. Maybe snowflakes brushing against the camera lens. I hadn't slept much, and I'd seen one too many horror movies the night before. That had to be it. I spent the morning cleaning, music playing loud enough to drown out my thoughts. By early afternoon, I almost felt normal again. The sun was out, and I decided fresh air would help. I bundled up, grabbed my car keys, and opened the front door. And there, in the snow just beyond the porch, were footprints. My throat went dry. They were large, heavy prints that started at the sidewalk and led directly to the porch, then stopped. No sign of them turning back. Just a perfect trail leading up to my house. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and checked the camera again. The lens was clean now. Clear. Like someone had wiped it off. That night, I couldn't relax. Every shadow felt darker. Every sound sharper. I kept the curtains drawn and triple-checked the locks. I told myself Chris would be home soon. At midnight, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. My blood went cold. I opened the app, and the live feed appeared. The porch was empty, but the camera was shaking just slightly, as if someone were touching it. Holding it, I muted the phone before the sound of my breathing could give me away. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, frozen, watching the feed. After a few seconds, the shaking stopped. And then, for just a moment, something moved at the bottom of the screen. Not a face. Not a hand. Just the faintest edge of a shadow before it disappeared. I stayed up until dawn, my back pressed against the locked bedroom door. The rifle Chris kept under the bed beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I just listened. But I never heard another sound. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me in the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing, one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the camera, just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step, thud. Louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops. To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house? Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before. But something was off, faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, maybe snowflakes brushing against the camera lens. I hadn't slept much, and I'd seen one too many horror movies the night before. That had to be it. I spent the morning cleaning, music playing loud enough to drown out my thoughts. By early afternoon, I almost felt normal again. The sun was out, and I decided fresh air would help. I bundled up, grabbed my car keys, and opened the front door. And there, in the snow just beyond the porch, were footprints. My throat went dry. They were large, heavy prints that started at the sidewalk and led directly to the porch, then stopped. No sign of them turning back. Just a perfect trail leading up to my house. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and checked the camera again. The lens was clean now, clear, like someone had wiped it off. That night, I couldn't relax. Every shadow felt darker, every sound sharper. I kept the curtains drawn and triple-checked the locks. I told myself Chris would be home soon. At midnight, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. My blood went cold. I opened the app, and the live feed appeared. The porch was empty, but the camera was shaking just slightly, as if someone were touching it. Holding it, I muted the phone before the sound of my breathing could give me away. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, frozen, watching the feed. After a few seconds, the shaking stopped. And then, for just a moment, something moved at the bottom of the screen. Not a face, not a hand, just the faintest edge of a shadow before it disappeared. I stayed up until dawn, my back pressed against the locked bedroom door, the rifle Chris kept under the bed beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I just listened. But I never heard another sound. When Chris came home later that day, he found me in the living room, curled up on the couch, pale and exhausted. He frowned, setting his bags down. "Hey, you okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and went to grab his bags. "Hey," he called from the doorway. "Why are there smudges all over the kitchen window?" The winter of 2018 in England was one of the heaviest snowfalls I can remember. At the time, I loved the snow. Loved the silence it brought, the way it muffled the world. But after what happened, I can't stand it anymore. My parents had planned a weekend trip to visit family in Devon. I was 16, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea of being stuck in a stuffy house with relatives I didn't particularly like. So I faked a stomach bug, To my surprise, they believed me and left me in charge of the house. I was old enough after all. Saturday was perfect. I played Fortnite, binged Netflix, and spent an hour outside throwing snowballs for our dog Luna. She's a scruffy spaniel with boundless energy, and nothing makes her happier than bounding through fresh snow. That evening, around 7 p.m., hunger struck. The fridge was full, but everything required too much effort. So I decided to walk to the local fish and chip shop in the village. It was about a 15-minute walk down a narrow footpath. Locals call it the Cut, lined with skeletal trees and flickering old street lamps. By the time I got my chips and battered sausage, the sky had turned a deep blue and black, and the snow had started falling lightly again. Clutching the warm paper bag, I started back through the Cut. About halfway home, I heard it, a snap from somewhere in the trees to my right. I froze, heart hammering, and turned my head slowly. The orange glow from one of the street lit the woods, casting long shadows across the snow. Nothing. Probably just a fox, I muttered to myself. But then I heard it again. 2 sharp cracks, closer this time. I walked faster, my breath fogging up in the cold air. I reached the final stretch of the Cut, where the last street lamp had been out for months. That section was pitch black. I hesitated for a second before pressing on, gripping the greasy paper bag like it was a lifeline. Then I heard it. A new sound. Footsteps, crunching heavy. I spun around, and my stomach dropped. A silhouette stood under the dim light of the second-to-last street lamp. It was tall, and it was running straight at me. I bolted. Snow kicked up around my ankles as I sprinted, slipping and sliding, barely staying upright. I burst out of the Cut, Luna barking madly from behind our front window. I fumbled with my keys, my gloved hands clumsy and shaking. The figure was close now, maybe 20 feet away. I jammed the key into the lock, threw myself inside and slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it tight. I stood there panting, staring through the frosted glass window. Nothing. The street outside was empty. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just someone messing around, another local trying to scare me. But that explanation didn't sit right. I spent the next few hours watching Netflix, Luna curled up at my side. I couldn't relax though. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my skin crawl. Around midnight, Luna started barking loud, frantic barks directed at the back door. I felt my stomach tighten. Slowly, I walked to the kitchen. The glass pane on the back door was foggy from the cold, and the garden outside was barely visible in the dim porch light. I flipped the outside light on. Nothing. Fresh snow blanketed the garden, and it looked undisturbed. I sighed, dragged Luna away, and went back to the couch. But something nagged at me. The snow. It wasn't entirely undisturbed. There were tracks leading to the back door, my tracks from when I'd come home earlier. Wait. I came in through the front door. Ice pooled in my veins. Slowly, I turned and walked back to the kitchen. The cold was more noticeable now. My breath fogged in front of me. The back door was open. Wide open. The layout of our house meant 3 directions from that doorway. The kitchen, the living room, or the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. As I stood frozen, there was a faint sound above me. A light thump. Upstairs. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I grabbed Luna, snatched my phone from the table, and bolted out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was at our neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until the lights flicked on, and Mr. Harris opened up, bleary-eyed and grumpy. His expression shifted when he saw my face. After I explained what happened, they let me in and called the police. The officers took nearly 40 minutes to arrive because of the worsening snowstorm. They searched the house top to bottom and found nothing. No one was there. But when they checked our CCTV camera, one my dad had installed above the back door, it showed something. Just minutes after I had left for the chip shop, a figure emerged from the woods behind our house. They walked calmly up to the back door, slipped inside, and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. About an hour later, just before I returned home, the same figure darted out of the house, vaulting over the back fence and vanishing into the snowy woods. The tracks in the snow had been filled in by fresh snowfall, leaving no trail to follow. For weeks after, I jumped at every creak in the house, every shadow outside my window. We installed new locks, brighter outdoor lights, and motion sensors. But it didn't change the fact that someone had been in my home, watching me, and worst of all, they knew I was there alone. Christmas Eve always made me feel hollow. The lights, the music, the cheer. It all felt like a cruel reminder that I had no one to share it with. No family, no friends, just me and my fading hope that things might change. This year, I decided to drive, not to anywhere specific, just away. I thought maybe the open road would make me feel less stuck. It was cold, snow had been falling all afternoon, and the roads were getting slick, but I didn't care. I kept driving. I was somewhere deep in the mountains, the kind of stretch where the nearest gas station might be 40 miles away, when I saw him, a man standing on the shoulder of the road. He was tall and skinny, with a ratty coat that hung off his frame like it barely fit. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his face was hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. The snow was falling heavier now, and he just stood there, motionless, as my car approached. I slowed down, more out of instinct than anything. What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere? There were no houses, no cars, nothing, just the woods and the road. As I pulled up beside him, I rolled down my window a crack. "You okay?" I called out. The man turned his head slowly toward me, but he didn't answer. "You need a ride?" I tried again. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, without a word, he nodded and walked toward the passenger door. Something about him made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the situation. It's not every day you see someone out in the middle of nowhere like that. Still, when he climbed into the car, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd made a mistake. He didn't smell like booze or drugs, just wet wool and cigarettes. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and there was something off about his eyes. They were sharp, almost predatory, but completely empty at the same time. "Thanks," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "No problem," I said, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road." That wasn't much of an answer, but I didn't press him. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost oppressive. The only sounds were the hum of the heater and the crunch of my tires on the snow-covered road. After a few miles, he finally spoke again. "You got any family?" The question caught me off guard. No," I said. "Not anymore." He nodded like he already knew the answer. "Must be nice," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed silent. The tension in the car kept building. Every so often, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting stiffly, staring straight ahead, his hands still buried in his coat pockets. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His feet. They were bare. No boots, no shoes, just pale, bony feet dusted with melting snow. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't answer. I tried again. "You sure you don't need me to take you to a hospital or something? It's freezing out there." Still nothing. I kept driving, my pulse thundering in my ears. My gut told me to get this guy out of my car, but the snow was coming down harder now, and I couldn't just kick him out in the middle of a storm. That's when I noticed him moving. At first, it was subtle, a shift of his weight, a twitch of his fingers. Then slowly, he pulled his right hand out of his pocket. I caught a glimpse of something shiny. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and calm. "What?" I stammered. "Pull over," he repeated more firmly this time. My mind raced. My first thought was to floor it, but with the snow piling up, there was no way I could outrun him if I slid off the road. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have any money. You can check my wallet if you want." "Just stop the car," he snapped, cutting me off. I slowed down, but not because I wanted to. The road ahead curved sharply, and I didn't trust myself to navigate it at speed. As the car crawled to a stop, I felt my heartbeat in my throat. "Turn it off," he said. I hesitated, but when he raised the knife just slightly, I did as he asked. The engine died, and for a moment, the world was eerily quiet. "Get out," he said. "What?" "Out now." My hands trembled as I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the door open. The cold hit me like a slap to the face, but I barely noticed. "Walk," he said, gesturing toward the woods with the knife. I stepped into the snow, my mind racing for a way out of this. The road was deserted, and even if someone came by, they'd never see me through the trees. "Move," he barked. I stumbled toward the tree line, the snow crunching beneath my boots. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, fogging the air in front of me. Then out of nowhere, I heard it, the faint rumble of an engine. A pair of headlights cut through the snow, and my would-be attacker froze. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver, a burly guy in a plaid jacket, jumped out. "What the hell's going on here?" he yelled. The man with the knife hesitated for a split second before bolting into the woods. I told the driver everything, barely able to get the words out through my shivering. He called the police, and we waited together until they arrived. They searched the woods, but didn't find him. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those empty eyes staring back at me. I don't know what his plan was, maybe to rob me, maybe worse, but one thing's for sure. I won't ever forget the way he looked, standing there in the snow, barefoot and calm, like he'd done this before. Last winter, I was driving home for the holidays. My family lives about 16 hours away, and I usually push through in one long, exhausting drive. But this year, the snow had come early, and the roads were slow and treacherous. I accepted that I'd probably need to stop somewhere overnight. I didn't book anything in advance, since I wasn't sure how far I'd make it. The snow had started lightly when I left, just a delicate dusting on the highway. But as the hours passed, it thickened. Traffic crawled. By 9 p.m., I'd barely covered half the distance. The frustration was mounting. The snowplows were nowhere in sight, and the thought of spending another 7 or 8 hours behind the wheel tomorrow made me want to scream. Around midnight, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I spotted a worn-out road sign for a motel at the next exit and took the turn. The place wasn't much to look at. A single-story strip of faded rooms with flickering neon lights spelling out vacancy. The parking lot was blanketed in snow, tire tracks barely visible. I pulled in and parked near the front office. Inside, the lobby was tiny and outdated, the smell of stale coffee and mildew hanging heavy in the air. A handwritten sign sat on the counter. Back in 15 minutes, there was a little doodle of a steaming coffee cup beside it. I sighed and went back to my car. That's when I noticed something odd. The parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car, no tire tracks showing fresh arrivals. Nothing. I leaned back in my seat, watching the snow whip across my windshield, and tried to convince myself that the manager had just stepped out briefly. Maybe they walked to a nearby gas station. The heater hummed softly as I adjusted my seat and decided to close my eyes, just for a few minutes. When I woke up, the car was cold again. My windshield was half covered in a thick layer of snow, and the storm had intensified. The clock on my dash read 3:27 a.m. As I rubbed my eyes, I froze. Someone was standing just outside my driver's side window, staring straight at me. I jerked upright, and the man flinched back a step. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could see enough of it to notice the sharpness in his eyes. He turned his head and shouted something into the snowy darkness. That's when I noticed headlights cutting through the storm from a large pickup truck parked across the lot. Another man stepped out of the driver's side and started walking toward me. The first guy circled around my car, yanking on the door handles one by one. The second man joined him, and they began murmuring to each other before one of them sprinted back to the truck and returned with something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked heavy. My heart was hammering as I jammed the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly against the snow-packed pavement. I tried again, rocking the car back and forth, but I wasn't moving fast enough. The sharp sound of glass shattering filled the air. The back window behind me exploded inward, and icy shards rained over the back seat. One of the men reached through the broken glass, fumbling for the door lock. My breath caught as I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car finally lurched backward, skidding violently to one side. The man reaching through the window lost his balance and tumbled out into the snow. The other guys sprinted back to the truck, but I didn't wait to see if they'd follow. I gripped the wheel, spun my car around, and fishtailed my way out of the parking lot. For a few agonizing seconds, I could see their truck's headlights in my rearview mirror, but they didn't follow me onto the main road. Instead, they disappeared into the swirling snow, swallowed by the storm. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I parked at a well-lit gas station, shaking so hard I could barely pull my phone out to call the police. They took my report, but I could tell from their tone that they weren't too optimistic about catching anyone. Looking back, I still kick myself for falling asleep in that parking lot. Maybe I should have kept driving, or picked a bigger hotel off the main road. But those men, they were prepared. Their timing, their movements. It felt like they had done this before, maybe many times. Whatever they had planned, I'm grateful I never had to find out. I'm 27 now, but this happened when I was 26. My mom passed away a few years back, and my dad, Mark, has been blind since I was a kid. Fortunately, he made some smart financial moves early in life. He sold a successful energy business, which left us comfortable and able to manage multiple rental properties. My sister Amy and I live together in our family home, while Dad lives in a cozy one-story condo about 10 minutes away. It's within walking distance of the village, where he can get groceries and run small errands. Dad is stubbornly independent and manages well on his own, but Amy and I take him to doctor appointments or anywhere too far to walk. This all happened during a brutal winter storm. Amy was staying over at her boyfriend's house about 30 minutes away, so I was home alone. The snow was relentless, thick flakes swirling under the streetlights and roads coated in slush. Something gnawed at me that evening. I decided to call Dad just to check in. He still prefers his landline over his smartphone because, in his words, why fix what isn't broken? But the call rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried again, same result. Normally Dad answers immediately or calls back within minutes. I called Amy. She hadn't heard anything about Dad going out. That's when the anxiety started to settle deep in my chest. The storm was no joke, and the thought of Dad walking out in it made my stomach twist. I grabbed my coat and keys and started the drive to his condo. The roads were nearly empty, and my phone kept buzzing with weather advisories. By the time I arrived, the world was blanketed in a heavy, eerie silence. The first thing I noticed were footprints in the snow leading up to the condo's door and away from it. Fresh ones. That should have reassured me, but instead, it made me feel uneasy. As I approached, the neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Mrs. Harris, peeked out her door. "Oh, hello dear," she said warmly. "My husband just gave your father a ride to the shop about 10 minutes ago. He should be back soon." I smiled and thanked her, feeling slightly better. I figured I'd wait inside. The door was unlocked. Dad always forgets to lock the door, despite Amy and I reminding him 1,000 times. I sighed, stepped inside, and shut the door behind me. The condo was quiet. Too quiet. Something immediately felt off. The faint smell of wet clothes and cold air hung in the air. As I took off my boots, my eyes caught something. Faint, melted footprints leading from the front door, through the living room, and down the hallway toward Dad's bedroom. "Dad?" I called out. No response. The tracks led into his room and stopped at the ensuite bathroom door, which was closed. Dad never closes doors. It makes navigation harder for him. My stomach tightened. I walked slowly down the hall and into his room. His phone was vibrating on the nightstand, lighting up with my missed calls. But the bed was empty, and the bathroom door remained shut. I knocked lightly. "Dad?" Nothing. The shower curtain was drawn shut, which was even stranger. Dad always leaves it open, another habit to make navigating easier. I froze, staring at the curtain. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. Something inside me screamed, not to touch that curtain. Instead, I backed out of the room, quietly shut the door, and walked straight to the front door. I stepped outside, locked it behind me, and called the police. The storm had slowed response times, but to their credit, 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. Together, we re-entered the condo. When we reached Dad's bedroom, the sight made my blood run cold. A man was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands raised in surrender. He was soaking wet, his shoes still leaving faint puddles on the carpet. It was like he had been waiting. Dad arrived home minutes later with the neighbor's husband. The confusion and concern on his face broke my heart. The officers questioned the man and found his ID. He lived just a few units down. Apparently he had been watching Dad's routine for a while, waiting for the right opportunity. Maybe he thought the snowstorm gave him cover. Maybe he thought no one would check in on Dad during such awful weather. Whatever his plan had been, it didn't work out. The scariest part? He had hidden in the bathroom when I first arrived. If I had opened that curtain, my dad, ever the gentle soul, didn't even want to press charges. But Amy and I insisted. The man was eventually charged with 3rd-degree burglary and is still in jail as far as I know. We replaced Dad's locks, installed extra security cameras, and made sure every neighbor in the building knew to keep an eye out for him. But even now, every time I see a heavy snowfall coating the streets in white silence, I feel a prickle of unease. Because I know how close I came to pulling back that curtain, with a spacious yard and a stunning view of the mountains. After a long drive with the kids squabbling in the back seat, we arrived just before dusk. The place was just as nice as it looked online, maybe even better. My wife, Emily, smiled as we unpacked, and the kids ran off to explore the yard. It felt like the start of a much-needed break. As we carried bags inside, the neighbor introduced himself. He was standing at the edge of his driveway, just a few steps from our rental. A tall, wiry man with graying hair and an overly enthusiastic smile. "Hi there, I'm Gary," he called out, waving. "I live right next door, you folks just get in." I nodded, trying to be polite, but already feeling something off. His smile lingered a little too long, and his eyes seemed to dart over the house, the car, and then back to us. "Yeah, I just arrived," I said, looking forward to some peace and quiet. He chuckled. "Oh, you'll get that here, all right. Not much goes on around here. If you need anything, just let me know. I'm always around." The way he said it made my skin prickle. That first night, we didn't think much of him. Gary seemed harmless, just an overly friendly neighbor. But the next morning, when we took the kids outside to play, he was there again. This time, standing in his yard, arms crossed, staring into ours. He waved when he saw me looking, his face breaking into that same too-wide smile. I waved back reluctantly. Emily frowned. "Is he just going to stand there?" She whispered. "Probably just bored," I muttered, brushing it off. But every time we looked up, he was still there, standing in his yard, watching us. Later, after lunch, we settled into the lounge room. The kids were playing a board game on the floor, while Emily and I read on the couch. It was peaceful until I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Gary was standing outside the lounge room window. I froze, unsure if I was seeing things. But when I looked again, there he was. His face was partially obscured by the glass, but I could tell he was staring right at us. I stood abruptly, and he didn't flinch, just kept watching. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, following my gaze. When she saw him, her face went pale. I moved to the window and opened it just enough to say, "Can I help you with something?" Gary smiled. "Oh no, just saw you all in there and thought I'd say hi. Nice view from this side of the house, huh?" I didn't respond. He lingered a moment longer before finally walking away. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Emily and I sat out on the balcony with a bottle of wine, trying to shake the unease from earlier. The night was crisp and quiet, the stars bright overhead. But then I saw him again. Gary was on his balcony, directly across from ours, sitting in a chair and watching us. He wasn't trying to hide it either. His chair was angled toward us, and his face was dimly illuminated by a weak porch light. "Let's go inside," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. The next day, the tension only grew. Every time we stepped outside, there he was. If the kids were playing in the yard, he'd find some reason to be in his. When we walked to the car to head into town, he came out of his house and waved. He was always there. By the third night, I was on edge. I double-checked the locks before bed, something I rarely did at home. Emily and I stayed up late, talking about whether we should cut the trip short. We finally decided to sleep on it, hoping things would feel different in the morning. But I woke up to the sound of a floorboard creaking. At first I thought it was one of the kids. I sat up listening, but the house was silent. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What?" She mumbled groggily. "Someone's in the house." Her eyes widened and she sat up, clutching my arm. We both listened, hearts pounding. The footsteps were moving toward the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. Emily followed, clutching her phone. When I peeked around the corner, I saw him. Gary, standing in the middle of the kitchen, illuminated by the faint glow of the microwave clock. "Hey," I shouted, stepping into the room. Gary's head snapped toward me, and for a split second he looked startled. Then he bolted. He was out the back door before I could stop him. I called the police while Emily locked every door and window. The kids woke up crying, frightened by all the noise. When the police arrived, they searched the house and the surrounding area, but Gary was gone. The officer we spoke to said Gary's house looked like it hadn't been lived in for months. It was mostly empty, aside from a few pieces of old furniture. There was no sign of him anywhere. The next morning, we packed up and left, cutting the trip short. The kids were quiet on the drive home, and Emily kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see Gary's face behind us. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself checking the locks, imagining the faint sound of footsteps in the hall. I don't know who Gary really was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never stay in another Airbnb again. I thought Christmas would be easier this year. No family, no friends, no expectations, just me, a quiet evening, and a cheap bottle of whiskey in my little rental house at the edge of town. I'd told myself I didn't mind being alone. I'd stopped pretending to care about the holidays a long time ago. All the lights, the music, the cheerful families, it just reminded me of what I didn't have. It was around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve when the knock came. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the tree I'd put up out of some half-hearted attempt to feel festive when I heard it. Knock, knock, it startled me. My house sits on the outskirts of town, practically in the woods. I don't get visitors, especially not at that hour, in the middle of a snowstorm. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I got up and moved cautiously toward the door, the whiskey warming my veins but not dulling my unease. "Who is it?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer. I glanced through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, his head down, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wasn't dressed for the weather, just a thin jacket and no hat, no gloves. Snow clung to his hair and beard. "Can I help you?" I asked, not opening the door. He looked up then, and even through the peephole I didn't like the way he smiled. Too wide, too forced. "Car broke down," he said. His voice was muffled by the wind. "Been walking a while, can I come in?" Something about him didn't sit right with me. He wasn't slurring, didn't seem drunk, but there was a strange intensity in his eyes, even through the distorting glass. "I can call someone for you," I offered, my hand tightening on the doorknob. "No service," he said flatly, "phone's dead. I just need to warm up." I hesitated. It was freezing outside, and the nearest gas station was miles away. If he was telling the truth, I'd be condemning him to freeze, but my gut told me to keep the door shut. "There's a diner about 2 miles back," I said. "They're open all night." His smile faltered. "Come on, man, it's Christmas," something about the way he said it. The sharpness under the words sent a chill down my spine. "Sorry," I said, my voice firmer now. "I can't help you." For a moment, he just stood there staring at the door. Then he stepped back, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said, turning and walking off the porch. I waited, listening to the crunch of his footsteps in the snow. They faded into the distance, and eventually all I could hear was the wind. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Something about him stuck with me, gnawed at the edges of my mind. I double-checked the locks and drew the curtains, but the sense of unease lingered. Around midnight, I was still awake, sitting in the living room with the lights off. The only illumination came from the Christmas tree, its soft glow casting long shadows across the walls. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It was softer this time, almost hesitant, but it sent my heart racing all the same. I crept to the door and peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty. My breath fogged the glass as I stared out into the night. The snow had stopped, and the moonlight reflected off the fresh powder, making everything look sharper, clearer. I scanned the yard, the edge of the woods, the road beyond. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw them. Footprints in the snow. They led from the road to my porch, but there were no tracks leading away. Panic clawed at my chest. I checked the locks again, grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen, and sat in the corner of the living room, my back to the wall, where I could see both the door and the window. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of the old wood, every groan of the wind made me flinch. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the knife, my ears straining for any sound. Just when I thought maybe, just maybe I was safe, the power went out. The Christmas tree went dark, plunging the room into shadow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The only light now came from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. And that's when I heard it. Not a knock this time. A scratch. Soft, deliberate, right at the edge of the window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes locked on the thin sliver of moonlight seeping through the curtain. A shadow passed in front of it. I didn't wait. I bolted for the bedroom, locking the door behind me and shoving the dresser in front of it for good measure. I sat there in the dark, my back against the wall, the knife still in my hand, and waited. The scratching moved around the house from one window to the next, then back to the front door. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to leave the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I moved the dresser and unlatched the door. The house was empty, but outside, the snow told a different story. Footprints circled the house, over and over, crisscrossing back and forth like whoever made them had been pacing all night. I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the trees. I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is, I'm never spending Christmas alone again. Last winter, my friend Colin and I decided to escape the humdrum of our everyday lives in a small town by heading into the Alaskan wilderness for a week. We'd heard about a remote cabin online, advertised as the perfect retreat with breathtaking views and a wood-burning stove to keep us cozy. It was located about 2 hours from my place, tucked deep in the forest, far from civilization. The idea of being surrounded by snow-covered trees and peaceful nights by the fire sounded like a dream. We packed up and set out in the early afternoon, the drive uneventful at first. But as we got closer to the cabin, the road began narrowing and eventually gave way to a narrow trail cutting through the vast, snow-covered forest. By the time we arrived, dusk was beginning to settle, casting long shadows across the snow. The cabin was small but inviting, with just one bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a fireplace that had seen better days. The silence surrounding it was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. After we unpacked, we decided to explore the forest before darkness fully set in. The quiet was unsettling, the kind of silence that felt like it was pressing in on you, like the trees were watching. We walked along a winding path, the snow crunching beneath our boots. That's when we heard it, an eerie scream, faint at first but unmistakably human. Colin and I froze, exchanging nervous glances. Then it came again, louder and more desperate. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold, like someone was in grave danger. "We need to check it out," Colin said. He was always the braver one, maybe even reckless. I hesitated, wanting to turn back, but the thought of someone in trouble in that desolate place pushed me forward. We followed the sound, our footsteps quick and uneven as the screams grew louder. Soon we spotted a flickering light in the distance. It came from an old, rundown cabin, its windows grimy and roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The light inside flickered, either from a lantern or a fire. As we crept closer, the screaming stopped, replaced by muffled sounds, someone crying or gasping for air. Colin motioned for me to stay back as he approached the window. He wiped away a small patch of frost and peered inside. When he turned to me, his face was as white as the snow. "There's a man tied to a chair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And another man, he's wearing a mask and holding a knife." A cold wave of dread washed over me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like jelly. Before I could react, a voice suddenly cut through the air behind us. "What are you doing?" We spun around. A man stood just a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them piercing through us, cold and unblinking. Neither of us said anything. Colin grabbed my arm, and we bolted. The man shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. The forest blurred around us as we ran. The crunch of snow underfoot, and the sound of his heavy footsteps chasing us. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded in my chest. I dared not look back. We reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment we stood there, panting, trying to catch our breath. Then we turned off the lights and peered out the window, expecting to see the man coming after us. But the forest was empty. The wind howled through the trees, and nothing moved. Colin grabbed his phone and called the authorities. It felt like hours before we saw the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the dark. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle, their breath fogging in the cold. We hurried outside and told them everything. The screams, the man tied up, the masked figure, and the man who had chased us. The officers didn't seem entirely convinced, but agreed to check out the old cabin. We led them through the forest, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. When we reached the cabin, my stomach dropped. It was empty. No light, no signs of life. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, there was nothing but an empty room with a dusty floor and a broken chair in the corner. The officers assured us they'd continue searching, and told us to stay put for the night. We didn't sleep at all. I couldn't shake the image of the masked man, and I kept wondering if he was out there, waiting, watching us. 2 days later, the authorities called to say they'd caught both men, the masked man and the one who had been tied up. The officer on the phone sounded uneasy, like there was more to the story than he was letting on. When I pressed him for details, he just said, "It's better if you don't know." We left the cabin that same day, cutting our trip short. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was hiding something we weren't meant to uncover. Even now, back at home, I can't shake the memory of that night. The screams, the masked man, the chase, it's all etched into my mind. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can almost hear that voice in the forest again. It was December in Minnesota, and the world outside my window was blanketed with about a foot of snow. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet, as if the snow had muffled every sound, leaving only a heavy stillness in the air. My parents were out at a bar that night, and my brother was at a friend's house, leaving me with the house to myself. I didn't mind the solitude, in fact, I enjoyed it. I was curled up in the living room, a blanket wrapped around me, watching some show on TV. The soft glow from the screen illuminated the room, while the rest of the house remained in darkness. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passing of time. I had just finished a bag of chips when I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the basement. At first I assumed it was just the old pipes groaning. Our house was old, and it often made strange noises, especially in the winter, But this sound was different, more deliberate, soft, but steady. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a cape, and made my way to the basement door. The floor felt cold under my socks, and the air seemed heavier as I reached for the door handle. I opened the door, flipped the light switch, and peered down the stairs. The light flickered for a moment before holding steady, casting long shadows across the walls. I took the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the bottom, I looked around. The basement smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. Everything was in its place, boxes stacked neatly in the corners, an old desk covered in papers, and a few plastic bins near the far wall. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I walked around, checking the small windows for any signs of movement or a draft that could have caused the noise. But there was nothing, just the stillness. With a shrug, I figured it was probably my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe the snow shifting against the house. I went back upstairs, closed the basement door, and returned to the couch. 5 minutes later, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. A loud crash from the basement, followed by the sound of a door slamming open. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the basement door. This time it was a sound I couldn't ignore. It was sharp and clear, like something heavy being knocked over. I hesitated for a moment, the house suddenly feeling too quiet, the shadows in the corners darker than before. My hands were cold and clammy as I walked back to the basement door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe my brother had come home early, trying to scare me as a joke. "Ryan, is that you?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. I called again, louder this time, but the only response was the faint hum of the basement light. I swallowed hard and started down the stairs. The air felt colder now, and the basement light flickered once more as I reached the bottom. What I saw made my stomach drop. The desk drawers were open, and papers were scattered across the floor. Boxes that had once been neatly stacked were now tipped over, their contents spilling out. The plastic bins near the wall had been knocked over, their lids lying a few feet away. It looked like someone had been searching for something. But the worst part was the back door. It was wide open. The glass was fogged up from the freezing air pouring in, and snow had blown inside, forming a thin layer on the floor near the doorframe. Leading out into the backyard were footprints. They were deep, clear, and fresh, disappearing into the snowy night. I froze for a moment, my thoughts spinning. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in my basement while I was just a floor above. Oblivious. The thought made my skin crawl. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it as quickly as I could. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I called my parents. My mom answered, and I tried to explain what had happened, my voice trembling. She told me to stay put. They were on their way home. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to follow the footprints. My mom stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, trying to keep me calm. My dad's boots crunched through the snow as he moved across the yard, following the tracks over the fence and onto the road behind our house. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. The footprints stopped at the road. Whoever it was had probably gotten into a car and driven away. The police came soon after. They walked through the basement, taking notes and looking for signs of forced entry, but there were none. The door hadn't been broken. It had been unlocked. My dad swore he had locked it earlier, but maybe it hadn't latched properly. The officer said it might have been a random burglary, someone picking our house because it looked empty, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The way everything had been searched so carefully made it feel personal, like whoever it was had been looking for something specific. I used to be a police officer in a city in Virginia. There is one upscale neighborhood in our city with very nice homes, and when I was a new officer, I was often told stories about a doctor who used to live in one of those homes. The story goes that the doctor attempted to perform some type of operation on himself. He numbed his stomach area to make an incision, but since he couldn't feel it, he accidentally cut too deep and wide, ultimately disemboweling himself. When officers and paramedics arrived, they found him barely alive, holding his own intestines, and he eventually died. Fast forward to when I was assigned to a call about a young woman found dead by her older sister. When I arrived on the scene, it was in the aforementioned nice neighborhood. As soon as I exited my vehicle, I had an uneasy feeling about the house. While it looked nice from the outside, there was just a bad energy surrounding it. As I approached the front porch, I noticed countless empty energy drink cans and a Ouija board on the front patio table. Everything about this house just felt wrong, and once inside, the family was obviously very distraught. I was told the deceased, whom we'll call Emily, was in the basement, and by that time another officer had arrived, so he stayed upstairs with the family while I went down to the basement. The basement was unfinished and fairly dark, with only 2 pull-string light bulbs, one on each side. The scene in the basement was similar to the front porch. Energy drink cans were scattered everywhere, and there was another Ouija board on a small coffee table. Emily, who was 19 if I remember correctly, was hanging by her neck from a basement rafter. She had used an exercise band, and her body was swinging slightly. Her face was blue, bloated, and contorted into a horrible expression. Another officer helped me take her down. Emily's family consisted of her mother, father, and older sister. Her parents said that they had been trying to help her, because all she ever did was stay up all night drinking energy drinks and playing with the Ouija board. Her sister provided more detail. She said that she and Emily were very close and told each other everything, and according to her, Emily had become obsessed with the Ouija board, staying up all night to talk to what she believed was her boyfriend, who was dead. Emily had been telling her sister that her boyfriend was begging her to join him in the afterlife, which is why her sister believed she did what she did. Now let me reiterate. This house felt wrong. There was an overwhelming sense of unease and sickness in the basement, and it wasn't because of the body. This wasn't my first death scene. This call really messed with me for a while. We never got much more explanation, and as cops, you just have to move on to the next call. Now 2 weeks later, to the day, I responded to a call about a car accident with ejection, and I head to the scene with lights and sirens and arrive to find a convertible BMW that had clearly experienced a horrific crash and rollover. It was sitting on its wheels, and in the driver's seat was a woman with a broken neck, her head twisted almost completely around. About 25 feet away from the car was a man who had been ejected. Since it was a convertible, he must have been thrown from the top. The top half of his head was missing, and pieces of his brain matter were scattered everywhere. As I walked 75 yards away from the accident to close off the scene with yellow tape, I found yet another large chunk of his brain. Now I'm not trying to be intentionally graphic or gross, but I want to paint a clear picture of just how violent this car accident was. When I obtained the man's ID and radioed it in to dispatch, another officer and I realized the same thing at the same time. These 2 people were Emily's parents, who had died in a terrible accident exactly 2 weeks after her death. Breaking the news to the older sister was heartbreaking. I kept in touch with her for a while. She had inherited her parents' estate and life insurance money, and she ended up selling everything and buying a new house to try and start over and build her life. However, the story doesn't end there. You see, about a month later, another officer was called to the scene after a pedestrian was struck by a car while jogging in her neighborhood. And yes, you guessed it, it was the sister. She survived several weeks in a coma, but ultimately did not make it. If you're wondering why the story about the doctor is relevant, it's because the house where Emily took her own life was the same house that doctor had lived in. I don't know what to think, but to me it seems like either the house is cursed, or Emily opened up something very dark. That was a few years ago, and I'm no longer a police officer, as that's a story for a different time, and I've since moved a couple of states away. All I know is that I'm just glad to be as far away from that cursed situation as possible. When I was 10, my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. My father inherited an old house in remote New South Wales from a distant relative we barely knew. He thought it would be an idyllic place to raise a family, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did he know what awaited us. The house was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense bushland. It was the perfect picture of tranquility, at least during the day. The house itself had an eerie, antiquated charm, with creaking floorboards and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. My family consisted of my father, my mother, my older sister Lucy, and me. We moved in with excitement and a sense of adventure, unaware of the horrors that would soon unfold. The first few nights were pretty uneventful. My father busied himself with repairs, my mother unpacked, and Lucy and I explored the property. On the 4th night, I had my first encounter. I was in my room, reading a book, when I felt a sudden chill. The room seemed darker than usual, and I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I looked up, and there, peering around the corner of the doorframe, was a figure. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but I could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and the figure remained there for a few agonizing moments before disappearing. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, despite the creeping fear that settled in my bones. Weeks passed, and odd things continued to happen, mostly to me. My toys would be moved around, and my bed would occasionally shake in the middle of the night. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares or childish imagination. One night, I woke up to a whispering voice hissing my name. I sat up, drenched in sweat, and saw the same figure from before, now at the foot of my bed. It was closer and clearer. It had no features, just an inky blackness. I screamed, and my mother rushed in, and the figure vanished the moment she opened the door, leaving her to comfort me and dismiss it as a bad dream. It wasn't until Lucy had her own experience that my parents began to take things seriously. She came to me one morning, pale and shaken, saying that she'd seen a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with hollow eyes. My parents started to believe something was off, but didn't want to admit that something supernatural might be happening. Our situation escalated over the 5 years that we lived there. It started out small, lights flickering, strange noises, and cold drafts, but grew increasingly malicious. 2 experiences stand out vividly in my memory from what I recall. The first happened during our 2nd year. My father had gone into town, leaving the rest of us alone, and it was a stormy night, and the house seemed alive with almost its own energy. Lucy and I were in the living room, trying to watch TV, despite the frequent power flickers, and suddenly, the room went ice cold, and the TV turned off entirely. In the next moment, the corner of the room darkened, and we both saw it. An unmistakable figure, peering out from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the dim light. It slowly moved closer, and we could make out the shape of its mouth, twisted into a very cruel smile. Lucy grabbed my hand, and we bolted upstairs to my parents' room, locking the door behind us. My mother tried to calm us down, but she too felt the coldness and unease that permeated the house. Another terrifying event occurred in our 4th year. My father had become more open to the idea that something was clearly wrong. He brought in a local priest to bless the house after numerous pleas from my mother, and that night, after the blessing, I was in the kitchen getting a drink of water when I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw the same figure that had haunted me for years, now clearer than ever. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with one side of his face hideously scarred. He stood at the entrance of the kitchen, blocking my exit, and I was paralyzed with fear. He began to move towards me, slowly, deliberately, and every step he took seemed to drain the warmth from the room. I fell to the floor, unable to move, only managing to scream when he was inches away. My father burst in, and the figure vanished, leaving the air thick with dread. The priest's blessing had stirred whatever malevolence resided there. In our final year, things became unbearable. The entire family started hearing voices, footsteps, and seeing the figure, now bolder and more frequent in its appearances. It seemed to thrive on our fear, growing stronger and more aggressive. Doors would slam, objects would fly across the room, and we all felt watched all the time. We decided enough was enough. One evening, as we packed our things to leave, the activity reached a fever pitch. The house shook, the temperature dropped to freezing, and all of us saw shadows darting around. It seemed the entity didn't want us to go, but we were very resolute in our decision. We moved out the next day, leaving behind that cursed house and never looking back. Later on, we learned that the house had a very dark history. The man who built it in the 1800s was rumored to have gone mad and taken the lives of his family. His spirit, along with others, was said to haunt the property, reliving their final moments in a twisted loop of torment. Living in that house changed us all. We never spoke of it much after we left, but the memories lingered. And even now, years later, sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, half expecting to see a face peering around the corner, watching and waiting. In October 2017, I lost my husband while I was 7 weeks pregnant. And the day he died, I left for work in a hurry. We exchanged some texts after he woke up, discussing a phone interview that he had later that day and the pain that he was experiencing in his leg. We had a quick phone call a couple of hours later, where he mentioned that he was running to the pharmacy for pain meds. About an hour after that, I tried calling him several times to make sure that he got home safely, but there was no answer, which was very unlike him. I kept calling him for hours until, finally, a woman answered his phone, and she told me that she was with the sheriff's apartment and asked me to come home. At the time, I worked in a prison and, fearing that he might have gotten into some sort of trouble, I left my post, got to my car, and sped through the 30-minute drive back to town. As I turned into our parking garage, I saw a large white van that read Coroner. When I approached her home, I was greeted by the same woman who had spoken to me on the phone, blocking my view into the house. She informed me that my husband had suffered a heart attack, later confirmed as a pulmonary embolism, which explained the leg pain that he had mentioned earlier that morning. Apparently, my husband made it home, locked the security door, and then collapsed. He screamed for help. Our neighbor and her son had heard him and rushed over, but they couldn't get inside because all the doors and windows were locked. The son later apologized for not breaking a window, saying that, in his shock and panic, he lost all sense of reason. They spoke to my husband through the door while they called 911, but he stopped responding just moments before help arrived, and he was pronounced dead on arrival. A week or so after his service, his best friend's wife offered me a cleansing and a card reading by her mother. And although I was skeptical, I was desperate for any kind of communication with him or closure. And during the reading, she mentioned many interesting things, but what stood out the most was that my husband was in a stage after death where the soul relives its entire life, similar to when people say that their life flashes before their eyes. She explained that this is a place every soul visits after death as a way to reflect on the life they lived. She also said his death was so sudden that he hadn't yet realized that he had died and that I would need to help him cross over. She felt strongly that I was the one who could help him and instructed me to light white candles and place a jar of water to guide him to peace. A few months later, I moved into my parents' house. One day, while lying on the couch, I suddenly felt a heavy sensation, almost as if I had been administered anesthesia. It felt like sleep paralysis. When I could finally open my eyes, I was still on the couch in my parents' living room, but my husband was sitting on a chair right in front of me, as clear and as real as he had been before he died. Before I could even speak, he started talking. He told me that he was nervous about his upcoming phone interview, the one that he had the day he passed. He said he was excited and hopeful about getting the job and asked for help preparing. I looked at him with tears in my eyes, feeling the weight of what I had to say. I told him, "Baby, I'm so sorry. Do you remember the pain in your leg? You had blood clots. One of them made its way to your heart. You aren't going to make it to the interview, baby. You died." I'll never forget the look on his face. First confusion, then the slow realization of what I had just told him. I apologized again, told him I loved him and begged him to respond, but he just sat there with that strange expression. And suddenly I woke up. The chair from my parents' kitchen table was now sitting directly in front of me, empty. I never dreamed of him again after that, and I pray it's because I gave him the closure that he needed to cross over. We now have a 5-year-old son who often dreams very specific dreams about his father. He talks about things that he couldn't possibly know unless it came directly from him. Losing my husband was my first real experience with death, but it brought me peace to have my own confirmation that there is something more after this life. This experience I'm going to describe has taken a while for me to get together and actually write down. It takes place in Yosemite National Park in August of 2017 with my two best friends, Zach and Andrew. Zach had worked that summer as a parking agent at Glacier Point and was pretty familiar with the area. His employee housing, he was given a house in Wawona with 2 other guys. Andrew and I were visiting for the week and had each been to Yosemite before. One of the nights, there we decided to watch the sunset over Chilnawana Falls. It was a great hike that Zach had done before. The trail was about 4 miles to the top with about a 2,000-foot elevation gain. We brought food and decided to hike up and take a swim in either the pools on top of the falls. We set out on a couple of hours before sunset. As we approached the top portion, we were about half a mile to the top of the falls where a guy, about our age, early 20s, ran up to us from bushes frantically asking for help. His friend had fallen 50 feet off of a cliff and had shattered his femur. Zach was used to this, and after working in the park all summer, he had seen many injuries and was used to it. The man didn't have cell reception, but I did, so I called 911 and reported the accident, requesting search and rescue. After a few minutes, we decided that we wanted to continue the hike after search and rescue assured us that they would be there soon with a helicopter. We told the guy that help was on its way, and we continued the next half mile up to the top of the falls. When we got up there, it was a picture-perfect scene. A beautiful sunset as we swam and ate. We then got an amazing show as we saw the helicopter land to pick up the injured guy that we had just encountered right below us. I'm a private pilot and Air Force aviator, so I loved every second of watching the helicopter land on the mountainside. After the sunset, we began the hike down and past the spot where the injured guy in search and rescue was taking care of him. We had a brief encounter with them. They thanked us for calling it in. It was now dark out, and we continued the hike down. There wasn't much moonlight, and it was pretty dark, so we used our phones as flashlights to see the trail. And this is where the story gets interesting. The top of the hike was switchbacks with a steep incline on the right and a steep decline on the left with shrubs and trees. It was definitely too steep to hike down, hence the switchbacks. At about 1 mile into the hike, Zach was in front with a light, and I was second, also shining my light, and Andrew was in the back. Zach was shining his light ahead and saw something sticking out from behind a tree that was about 15 feet ahead, just off to the right of the path, and instinctively shined his light on it. That's when whatever it was revealed itself from behind the tree and ran across the path down to the left and down the steep grade. It ran on 2 feet and resembled some sort of humanoid figure. It was a little shorter than us and clearly had 2 arms and 2 legs, and it moved in an inhuman way. It vaguely resembled a person with a head and limbs, but appeared to be just skin, no clothes at all. All 3 of us saw it, and we froze in our tracks. We continued shining the light where it had run, down the left side of the mountain, but we didn't see anything after it disappeared. We were absolutely terrified, none of us really knowing what to say, because we had no idea what we had just witnessed. The worst part was that we still had another 3-mile hike ahead of us, plus another 1.5 miles from the trailhead to Zach's house, all while knowing that this creature could be stalking us close by. Luckily, we made it to his house, terrified and exhausted but unharmed. Whatever it was must have been just as scared of us as we were of it. My question is, has anyone else had a similar experience in that area? I've done some research, and my best guess would be a skinwalker, but it didn't try to lure us into the forest with it. We had another strange experience a couple of years later in Tioga Pass, right outside the Tioga gate of the park. We were camping in a closed campground in that area, and in the middle of the night I woke up to go to the bathroom, and before exiting the tent, I saw an orb about 5 feet away floating by with a bright light. I don't think it was a person because Zach, Andrew, and I all saw the orb, and there wasn't anyone around us. Our friend Jackson, who was also in the tent, told us that the next morning that he had felt rocks being thrown at the tent all night, along with hearing footsteps nearby. Has anyone else ever had these similar strange experiences? I'd love to hear them. We all know what we saw, and we know that it wasn't human. I was confined to a hospital in Manila for severe pneumonia back in 2021 during the pandemic lockdown when masks were mandatory. I was about to be assigned a room when I saw a toddler in a red polka dot dress galloping around the emergency room and then leaving through the glass entrance. She wasn't wearing a mask, so I asked security if children were allowed, and the guard replied, in Filipino, "No children allowed." I was confused. Wasn't he seeing this rowdy kid? After I was confined to the 5th floor, I fell asleep and had a really weird dream. I went down and saw the young girl outside the emergency room, only this time she was weeping in anger and holding a hammer. When she looked up, she screamed, "Pa, why did you leave me?" Afraid of being hit with the hammer, I ran up the dim stairwell back to the 5th floor. All I remember was that I was slowly losing my breath, and when I looked back I saw her chasing after me, only now she was floating up the staircase. It felt like I ascended over 20 floors because the chase seemed never ending. The stairwell echoed with a pleading voice screaming, "Pa." By the time I reached my bed, I was physically out of breath, and that's when I woke up with dangerously low oxygen levels, gasping for air, already surrounded by 2 attending nurses. I was intubated for a few days after that. When I regained consciousness, I recounted my dream to my attending nurse. She froze in shock before asking, did she have a polka dot dress on? And I asked her how she knew. Apparently my dream was eerily similar to over 10 anecdotes from different patients over the decades, each one involving a girl in a polka dot dress who first appeared in the emergency area and then later in their dreams, chasing them until they woke up. The existence of this girl has been an open secret among the hospital staff, passed down from worker to worker since the 1970s. And I guess the backstory goes, more than 40 years ago, a small dengue-infected child was brought to the hospital by a young Chinese father in his 20s, and for reasons unknown, perhaps because she was an illegitimate child not recognized by the father's family, the dad abandoned her at the hospital, never to return. And the hospital recorded no proper identity for the little girl, and she eventually died alone. She was buried in the cemetery right across from the hospital, and a group of nurses helped bury the girl. They named her Shub, a Chinese Filipino term for youngest daughter. She wore a polka dot dress. The nurse told me that while they have never actually seen the ghost, they all know of her existence. They also know that the ghost only reveals herself to certain people. Strangely, All the patients who reported seeing her shared similar physical attributes: East Asian looking, i.e. Chinese, in their 20s, of average build, around 5 feet 8 inches, and on the brink of death. Perhaps patients who resembled her father. Did I remind her of him? I've come to believe the ghost of this girl is still searching for her father. I won't deny it. It felt like I was running from death itself, but in hindsight I wonder if the girl simply wanted a father. Maybe she wanted to bring one with her to the afterlife. By some miracle I survived the whole ordeal, and I returned to that hospital last year for a routine checkup, but I never saw that girl again. Call it a blessing or a curse, but for what it's worth, that dream woke me up to a second chance at life. And I hope you find peace wherever you are, little girl. Finding a rental in suburban Victoria that was actually affordable seemed like a miracle. My 2 housemates and I, all in our early 20s and juggling part-time jobs with university, couldn't believe our luck when we found a charming house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was suspiciously cheap for the area, but it added up to our good fortune and a landlord eager to fill the place quickly. We moved in during an unusually warm summer. The house had a dated but cozy feel with worn carpets and faintly creaking floorboards that we wrote off as part of its charm. It wasn't long before we started to notice some oddities. The first night, while we were unpacking in the living room, we heard footsteps running up and down the hallway. We dismissed it as the house settling, maybe some old pipes, but the footsteps continued every night, always around the same time, 2 a.m. My room was at the end of the hallway, so I was often the last to hear the footsteps before they faded away. One night I decided to stay up and see if I could catch whatever or whoever was causing the noise. I sat in the living room, lights off with only the glow from my laptop for company. And right on cue, the footsteps started. Light, rapid steps, unmistakably human yet not matching anyone's presence. As they approached the living room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew cold, and the footsteps stopped just short of the doorway where I was sitting. I looked up, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Now, we laughed it off the next day, but a sense of unease definitely lingered. And then came the touches. It started with Claire, one of my housemates. She'd been studying at the kitchen table, and would suddenly feel a light brush against her shoulder, like someone lightly running their fingers over her to get her attention. She'd whip around, expecting to see one of us, but the room would be empty. And over time, Sam and I experienced the same cold, fleeting touches, ever so gentle but profoundly unsettling. The real terror, though, began with the sightings. One evening, while we were all relaxing in the living room, I noticed a shadowy figure peering in through the window. I jumped up, thinking someone was trying to break in, but as I moved closer, the figure seemed to melt away into the night. Sam saw it too, confirming I wasn't just seeing things, and from that point on, the figure haunted us, watching us from the windows, always just at the edge of our vision, disappearing whenever we tried to confront it. The worst night of our lives in that house started just like any other. We had gathered in the kitchen for a late dinner. Plates and cutlery clattered as we joked about the house being haunted, nervously laughing off our fear. It was around midnight when things started to take a turn. As we sat eating, the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath became visible, hanging in the air like smoke. The kitchen light flickered, casting erratic shadows all around us. And then, without warning, the cupboard doors flew open and plates began to hurl themselves off the shelves. We stared in shock as they shattered against the walls and floors, and amid the chaos, a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek filled the air, echoing throughout the house. It wasn't just a noise. It was a tormenting sound, like something from the depths of a nightmare. We bolted from the kitchen, only to find the hallway blocked by that same shadowy figure. It loomed larger than ever, a dark mass with indistinct features, but a very real presence. And the air felt thick, almost tangible, with hatred and malice radiating from it like a feeling. We hesitated for what felt like an eternity, then bolted for the back door, leaving behind everything but our need to escape. We never spent another night in that house. We called the landlord the next morning, demanding an immediate termination of our lease, and surprisingly, or perhaps not, they didn't argue with us. We managed to find temporary accommodation with friends, and eventually secured a new place far away from that cul-de-sac and any lingering spirits. Only later did we find out that that house had a very dark history to it. Previous tenants had left suddenly, some claiming that the place was haunted, others describing experiences similar to ours. It wasn't something the landlord ever mentioned, and perhaps it wasn't something they believed or even wanted to believe. But living there changed us. We grew quieter, more introspective, and I find myself glancing over my shoulder a lot more, half expecting to see a shadow peering back at me even in the safety of my new home. Some nights, especially when it's quiet and the house is settling, I swear I can still hear those footsteps. My girlfriend and I moved into a new apartment roughly 3 years ago. Since then, she has been suffering from weekly episodes of sleep paralysis. Her brother used to have them when they were children, so she recognized what it was right away. She has described it as being completely paralyzed except for being able to breathe and move her eyes. Most of the time she sees a dark, tall figure moving around our apartment during these episodes. Sometimes she just hears it walking. Other times it's standing in the doorway staring at her, and occasionally it presses down on her chest, making it hard for her to breathe. She's a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, yet these sleep paralysis episodes terrify her. And now, here's the really scary part. She usually manages to wake me up during these episodes by breathing quickly and loudly. I can then wake her from it, which allows her to move again, and the figure disappears. What I haven't told her is that for the past 2 months I've seen this figure too. Right after I'm woken up by her breathing, I can see it bent over her, pressing down on her chest. It always disappears the moment I acknowledge it or try to wake her. I've also seen it standing in the hallway staring at me one night while I was home alone watching a movie. I pretended not to see it, and when I looked again it was gone. Now comes the dilemma. Do I tell my girlfriend that her sleep paralysis demon might not just be a product of her mind, since I've seen it too, and at the same time as her, when I wake her up from paralysis at night? I don't want to scare her. She's already terrified by the sleep paralysis, but at least she believes it's all in her head, and we can't afford to move. I think we can both live with this, as long as I never tell her the truth. But I need your advice. I was at a family friend's wedding today, which took place in the middle of a forest. It was a beautiful setting, but after a while I needed a break from the crowd, so I walked toward a small stream nearby, and that's when I saw someone. Now a little background. Last year, one of my closest friends passed away in a car crash. We were both into paranormal stuff, and they promised that they'd come to find me after they died. Since their passing, I haven't noticed anything unusual aside from occasionally seeing a shadow figure until today. The person standing by the stream had a birthmark on their face, and my friend had the exact same birthmark. They were wearing a limited edition shirt from a band that we both loved. The same shirt my friend wore the day they crashed. Even their hair color was identical to my friend's. I stared at this person for a while, and they smiled back saying hello, and they said my name, and I blinked, and they were gone, and I'm still just so confused and even terrified at what happened. It does give me a sense of peace, but I just need some reassurance that I'm not losing my mind. A few years ago, my mother passed away after a long battle with cancer. In her final weeks, she was bedridden at home, and at one point on some heavy pain medication. The whole family took turns helping and spending time with her, and what she told us towards the end gave us all a shock. She kept reacting as though something had scared her, and she would jump and say, "Oh God," or she'd swear as if something startled her. At first she didn't say anything, but then after a week or two she blurted out something one day that gave us all the creeps. "I wish he'd stop scaring me. Tell him to go away." She was irritated by something, or more precisely someone. Confused, we asked what the problem was, and she told us. Apparently during her final weeks, she kept seeing her deceased partner walking around the house. He'd walk down the hallway past her bedroom door, or sometimes sit in her room, and every time it happened it would make her jump with fright, as she obviously wasn't expecting to see him there. She seemed more annoyed than scared, and she saw him several times a day just going about his business, as if he had never left. Usually her reaction was, "Oh, for God's sake, go away." Not because she didn't want to see him, but because he kept startling her. And our first thought was that it was related to the pain medication that she was on, but the nurse assured us that it wouldn't cause hallucinations or visions. I know it scared the life out of us, and she entered a hospice a few weeks later, and the visions stopped. Weird, right? We still don't talk about it. That's just how unsettled we all really were. I moved into a rental house last year with my wife, built in the 40s, I think. It's an okay rental, but I'd never buy this place. It's a modge-podge of half-assed DIYs, including a house extension. The church across the road owns it, and the two of the people there have managed it for a while, and I don't know much of the history, but the first time I toured it, the basement has creeped me out. There's this weird yellow half-finished bathroom downstairs in the laundry room that is at least a few decades old. A telephone down there, and the rest is unfinished. There's a creepy chair in the corner that I swear I moved a few months ago, and a desk that I swear another chair used to be stacked on top of, but regardless, that's not why I'm making this post. Since we moved in, sometimes it's one of the draw cord lights, and I assume I forgot and left it on, although I'm pretty good about that kind of thing and I doubt it. And for the past few months, more often the main lights switched to the top of the stairs, and there's no way that I'd forget that. Lately, with us moving out in less than a week, it's been turning on every couple of days, which is more often than usual. I often notice it when I'm outside looking in, which is even creepier. The switch will physically be up too when it wasn't before, but today when it happened again, I had a creepy realization. It happens when we're sleeping. I know this because every night I go to my office down the hall from my bedroom and play games or do work in the dark. When I go into the hallway, it's always pitch black, and I have to turn on my phone flashlight. There are decent-sized gaps under the doors, and I'd noticed that the lights were on. Yesterday when we did the laundry, I made a mental note that I turned it off in the late afternoon. So it turned on after I went to bed, but before we went down there again. I also just generally get a bad vibe when I'm down there, and when the door is open. A few weeks ago, I left the door open a little because my cat wandered down there while I did laundry, and I was waiting for him to come up, and I swear when I was in my office the cat suddenly doesn't do. Nothing else weird has happened in the house on that living floor, but it generally can be very creepy. The hallway where the door to the basement is in general is the absolute creepiest spot, but I really want to know, what are your thoughts? I just woke up from a nap, and I've been silently lurking and reading other people's posts, which are super interesting, and I don't necessarily think anything too much about my experience when they're talking to me from the basement. My parents commuted to work at the time, which required them to get up at 3 in the morning, get ready for an hour, and then leave the house at around 4 in the morning. Since the northern part of my state where they work, we live in the central part, is very heavy with traffic. My parents built their house in 2013, and we moved in around that time too. My sister and I would sleep upstairs, and I was in college at the time. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and Grandma and my sister were sleeping. I was drinking my morning coffee in the dark, looking over my student email, when I heard a very clear woman's voice say, "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." From the basement. At first I thought that I was developing psychosis, since my sister has schizoaffective mood disorder, but I immediately noticed my dogs were staring right at the basement door. They heard it too, and so I barricaded the basement and went up to my room with coffee and locked the door, and now I'm perusing Reddit trying to find the answers. For some context, this was at the first house that I lived in, and I was around 4 or 5. Keep in mind I have a pretty overactive imagination as a kid, which is something I've experienced before. I woke up in the middle of the night in my mother's room. I forgot why I was in my mom's room, but I remember that she was sleeping and her room was lighted enough that I was able to look around the room. But when I looked towards her bedroom door, I saw 2 white figures seemingly playing. They appeared to be young, as they seemed smaller than, say, my father, and seemed around a little older than people my age I knew. They had actual masks to them, like shadow people in the best way to describe it, but instead of black they were completely white. Now anyway, when I saw them they stopped playing and stared right at me, and my whole body froze and I was unable to say anything. I didn't even want to wake up my mother. I was that frightened to move. Then the 2 figures started to walk to me, as excruciatingly slow as possible. As they crossed to my side of the bed, one of the boys had reached his hand out to touch me, and then faded away just as he reached me. It wasn't until a few years later when I brought this up with my dad, and he told me that he used to see a bunch of ghosts when he was a kid at our house. He grew up in my first house, but he never saw ghosts of 2 children. He did say that he heard a story growing up that there were 2 boys that actually died on that street that we lived in. One died falling down the stairs, and I didn't know the boys personally, and that's all I got. I told a few people this, and they brought up sleep paralysis, and I felt like I could move. I was just afraid to move in that moment. I did say that I had an overactive imagination back then, so it is entirely possible that I imagined it all, but it felt so real and unlike any night terror that I had brought up by my imagination. If you have any explanations, that would be awesome. I'll just sign off on that note. Let's get one thing straight. I've hiked the Blue Mountains before, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced during what was supposed to be a routine trek through its canyons. It began as a clear morning the kind Aussies brag about. The eucalypt haze that gives the Blue Mountains their name wrapped around the cliffs in a dreamy shroud. I set off from Katoomba, pumped for a day of solitude in the haunting beauty of the Gros Valley. Honestly, I should have turned back when I first felt that tingle in my neck, the one you get when you think someone's watching you. Being the dauntless bloke that I pretend to be, I chalked it up to the chill of the mountain air. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, my mind set on the shifting shadows between the gum trees, and that's when I got lost. The paths here wind around and double back like a snake. I've trekked them plenty, but today they had teeth, and they bit me hard. Hours passed, and I realized that I was properly stuffed. Night fell like a curtain, fast and unforgiving, and I've never known dark like that, not the city kind. This was a velvety pressing darkness that oozed into your bones and stayed there. Every tree looked like a gnarled hand, and every bush rustle felt like a warning. And here's the goosebump bit. I wasn't alone. Not once did I see it clearly, but by the twitch of twilight, there was something behind me, a presence that hummed with malice. You know those stories of Aussie spirits, the ones old-timers talk about in hushed tones by the fire? I'd laughed them off, but out their laughter was about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. It felt like a hunt, and I was the quarry stumbling over roots, and my breath a ragged prayer. My phone beeped a low battery warning. Seriously? Now? I pushed through the bush, gripping the phone like a talisman, but even tech's cold comfort was slipping away. The hours to dawn stretched eternal, and my world shrunk to the feeble circle of my dying light. When the brush gave way to an open dirt road, it felt like a mirage. I was giddy with relief, like this was some twisted outback Wizard of Oz junk. There wasn't a yellow brick road, but I'd have kissed that dirt if I hadn't been so parched. I followed it, boots crunching, every echo a question. When the ranger station silhouetted against the night had the look of a man who'd seen it all, and then some. He listened to my tale with a grave nod, and gave me a lift back to my Uda, throwing glances to the rear view like he expected my ghostly mate to be thumbing a ride. Don't hike alone, he said, his voice almost lost in the engine's growl, especially not when the mountain's restless. I haven't been back since. People say it was all in my head, dehydration, panic. I've had enough of those tricks, and maybe they're right, but sometimes when the city's asleep and my flat's quiet, I swear I hear that whisper of a presence, feel that shiver down my spine. Sydney's got enough to explore without looking for trouble, and if you ever find yourself up in the Blue Mountains, stick to the beaten path, and for the love of all that's holy, respect the signs, both the ones in the ground and the ones in your gut, and bring a bloody flashlight. I was 8, and my cousin along with her brother was staying over at our house in Bathurst, New South Wales. My cousin was about 15 years old. We lived in a 2-story home, so my parents and her brother were downstairs in the den. My younger sister and I were in the living room, while my older cousin was in a spare bedroom getting ready for bed. I was curled up on the couch watching TV. My cousin was sitting upright, her face pale. She told me the bed had been shaking, and thinking she was joking, I told her to stop messing around, and went back to the couch. 15 minutes later, another scream rang out even louder than before, and I rushed back to the spare room yelling, "What's wrong now?" And with wide eyes, she said the bed was shaking. Just as I was about to walk away, the bed started moving back and forth, as if someone or something was gripping it. My cousin burst into tears and jumped off the bed, and the shaking stopped instantly. I checked under the bed, convinced her brother was pranking us, but it was empty. Was it a poltergeist? And to this day I don't know if we imagined it, or if it was something real. Neither my cousin nor I have talked about it since. It was a quiet Wednesday evening, and I was alone in the house reading a book. My family had gone out for dinner, and I wanted some peace and quiet. I was deeply engrossed in a suspenseful chapter when I heard faint whispers coming from the hallway. I thought that it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but the whispers grew louder and seemed to move closer. My heart pounded, and I stepped into the hallway. Summoning all my courage, I walked toward the sound. The whispers stopped the moment that I stepped into the hallway. The hairs on my neck stood up, and a chill ran through me. Over the next few days, strange things happened more frequently. Lights flickered for no reason, doors creaked open by themselves, and some rooms had inexplicable cold spots. It happened so often that it became hard to ignore. One night while brushing my teeth, I saw a shadowy figure in the bathroom mirror behind me. My blood ran cold, and I quickly turned around, but the room was empty. I splashed water on my face, hoping that I was just tired, but the image of that shadow haunted me. These events terrified us. My cousin and I asked each other, "Did you hear that during the dark, quiet hours?" We didn't tell our parents, afraid that they wouldn't believe us or would think that we were just causing trouble. And one night the strange activities escalated to a peak. My family and I were in the living room trying to watch a movie, and halfway through the lights flickered, and the numbers grew louder, almost deafening, and objects began moving by themselves. Books flew off the shelves, picture frames shattered, and an old clock chimed erratically. In a panic, we ran to the den for safety, and that eerie activity followed us, as if something unseen wanted us gone. In the chaos, we decided that we couldn't stay any longer, and we packed our things and left the house that night for our peace of mind. Weeks later, when we returned to collect our belongings, the house felt different. The unsettling presence seemed to have vanished, leaving a very eerie silence, and we moved out soon after, leaving behind what had once been our home, but had turned into a place of unexplained terror. And that's our story. We don't really talk about it much, but to this day we have no idea what was really going on. When I was a teenager, like around 13 or 14, one of my mates from school lived in a kind of countryside area. It's hard to describe. We lived in the suburbs, but his area was a little further out and less suburban looking at the time. This was 25 years ago. I have no idea what it looks like now, by the way. I went to his place to stay from time to time, because there was always adventures to be had around his place. One day he mentions that there are caves near his house, old mine shafts to be more precise. They were in a kind of national park. I was super interested to go check them out with him, so we planned to go the following weekend, and I'd stay over the night before, and we'd set out early the next morning. The weekend came around, and we set out around 8 a.m. We went to the supermarket on the way, stocked up on drinks and snacks, and made our way to the caves. The national park was huge and beautiful. It was a great morning for a hike too. Not too hot and not too cold, with a nice blue-skied sunny day. We came to our first cave in the first 20 minutes of hiking. We grabbed our torches or flashlights and went in. It was only short, ending in a small chamber. At the far end of the chamber was a sturdy locked cage-type gate. My friend told me that some were locked off due to the very real chance of cave-ins or flooding. Since it wasn't too long, and it wasn't too dark, with a small amount of sunlight coming in from the entryway, we took a break and ate some snacks. It was good being out and about. I was never a fan of early mornings, but this was an exception. We resumed our trip after that short break, and came across several more similar caves. There were a few longer ones with evidence of people using them for underage drinking. Candles and beer cans coupled with shitty teenage graffiti. But these were an exception, and not too bad. For the most part, people seemed to respect the caves to an extent, and cleaned up after themselves. After about an hour and a half, we came across one that was a bit different from the others. It was a longer one, but evidence of people using it for anything was minimal. I was too embarrassed to say so at the time, but I got a really weird feeling when we entered it. It was weird because we had been in so many, and I felt nothing, but this one just made me feel uneasy. I looked at my mate, and he seemed fine, not wanting to appear soft. When we got to the end where the metal gate was, we found that it was unlocked and open. In fact, when we got closer, the wind seemed to blow it open slightly, although I didn't feel any wind. I got a chill up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like it was inviting us in. Without hesitating, my mate was like, "Let's go," and I was a little taken aback. How could he not be picking up on the bad vibes here? But I ended up not saying anything, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid and didn't want him hassling me later about it. I regret this now. So we went in. It was so dark in there. Our flashlights barely lit a couple of meters ahead of us. The tunnel seemed to go on and on. There was zero evidence of anyone having been there recently. "What do you think we'll find?" my friend whispered to me. "Dunno," I managed to mumble out. Unease was really starting to hit me now, to the point that I was beginning to feel nauseous. And then it got worse. I felt wind start to blow around my ankles. At first I paid it no mind, but then I thought, where is this sudden wind coming from? The temperature seemed to get colder at each step too. Then I felt the wind brush past my shoulder and face. My heart was beating so hard that I imagined it was echoing in the tunnel. Then I started hearing whispering all around me. It was faint and hard to work out the words. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. When I stopped, it too seemed to stop, and then the most bone-chilling sound I'd ever heard could be heard in the distance in front of us. Low at first, but definitely loud in no time. It was the bellowing scream of a man. One at first, but then I could make out multiple voices. I felt hands start to grab at me, and I could take it no more. I took off in a sprint back towards the exit. I could only half see the way, because the hand that I was holding my flashlight with was pumping up and down as it does when you sprint. I scraped my arms, legs, and shoulders against the rough rock walls several times, but I didn't care. It felt like I was running endlessly, but eventually I reached the gate, which I collided into. I thought it would be open still, but for some reason it was shut. In my panic, I couldn't seem to work out how to open it. Eventually I managed, and it swung towards me, and I left my mate not far behind me. We finally got out and just kept running until we finally realized that we were out of that tunnel. Upon realizing this, we collapsed in an exhausted heap, struggling to regain our breath. I'm not proud of this, but it was due to the overexertion. It was my only shirt for that weekend too, and I had to borrow one of my mates while we cleaned mine up in secret, because for some reason we thought we'd be in trouble. Just before we got up and left the area where we collapsed, I took one look back at the cave. It was kinda involuntary. I wasn't even thinking. When my eyes landed on that cave in trance, I swear I could see a shadowy figure in the darkness staring at us. I showed a look at my friend, and he saw it too. I was this close to puking again, but I held it down. We got up and hurriedly left the area. That was enough adventure for one day. We went back there a year or so later for nostalgia's sake. Also, we felt bigger and tougher. That particular cave was heavily locked off with no trespassing signs on it threatening hefty fines. Probably for the best thinking back. Teenage bravado makes young boys do stupid things sometimes, and we may not have escaped so easily a second time. This happened about 4 years ago when I was 17 living with my aunt. For some background, my aunt, my friend and I are all very spiritual and believe in ghosts. So anyway, I can't recall why, but I was grounded. My friend, let's call her C, wanted to come hang out around 6 p.m. She came by and we practically begged my aunt to let me go to McDonald's with C to get a drink. After a lot of bribing with promises to clean the house, she said yes, but told us to be home in 15 minutes. But of course, being 17, we took a detour on the way home and stopped in a nature strip. Basically a dirt strip with some houses that led out to well nature. Anyway, we pulled up, opened our car doors, and turned the car off to chill and just talk. We started saying how we both felt weird, like there was a presence in the car with us, but we kind of brushed it off. At some point the door slammed shut, and I mean slammed, not like wind. C laughed and thought it was me until she looked at me, and I was still facing her with a shocked look on my face. C immediately freaked out, slammed her door shut, turned the car on, and booked it out of there. While we were driving out, I said that it still felt like something was with us in the car. Immediately as I said that, it was C, and as soon as I said that, the light above us on the road went out, as did about 5 more perfectly timed as we drove under each. At this point we were zooming home to tell my aunt. We got home and practically fell out of the car running upstairs, but my aunt wasn't home. We sat on the balcony collecting ourselves and decided to go to our aunt's friend's house, who I forgot to mention was also spiritual. We'll call her S. We got back in the car and immediately we could feel that we weren't alone again, but we decided to continue to S's house. We arrived and I knocked on S's door, and she immediately said, "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I awkwardly laughed and said something like that to my aunt. She told me that she had gone home, so I sighed, thanked her and got back in the car. C and I looked at each other and simultaneously said, "It feels like it's gone." We finally calmed down and headed back to my aunt's. She basically laughed at us and told us not to be so scared because they feed off of fear. She saged us and we went on with our night. Fast forward to the next morning. I overheard my aunt on the phone with S, and S said, "I think there's something in my house." Home was never a stable place for me. For as long as I can remember, we moved from one city to another, constantly running from unpaid bills, my stepdad's drinking, or my mom's various drug problems. By the time I turned 8, I had lived in more towns than I could count on both hands. It was the summer of 2002 when we made our way to Winslow, Arizona. My mom claimed we were going there to reconnect with her stepfather, though she never explained why she thought that was a good idea. Winslow wasn't much to look at, a quiet, desolate town surrounded by vast stretches of dry desert. After a few months of constant fighting with her stepfather, we were kicked out of his house, forced to fend for ourselves once again. That's how we ended up at the Desert Sun Motel, a crumbling building on the edge of town. My family, me, my 2 older brothers, Liam, 10, and Tommy, 12, my mom, and my stepdad, squeezed into a single damp-smelling room with 2 small beds. It was far from ideal, but we'd gotten used to making do. My stepdad had one strict rule. We kids weren't allowed to stay inside the motel room during the day. Go outside and find something to do. He'd grumble, opening his first beer of the morning. It didn't matter that Winslow regularly hit over 100 degrees during the summer. We were banished to the barren parking lot every morning, left to entertain ourselves with whatever we could find. Sometimes we'd check the soda machines for forgotten coins, or sit under the motel's broken sign, trying to avoid the worst of the heat. Every so often, other kids would stay at the motel, usually with families as down on their luck as ours. That's how I met Daisy. Daisy was 9, like me. She had scraggly blonde hair and a mischievous grin that made you feel like she was always up to something. She wasn't exactly nice, she had a bossy streak a mile wide, but she was company, and that was all I needed. "Let's see if the soda machine's unlocked today," she suggested one afternoon, tugging on my arm. It's never unlocked, I replied, kicking a pebble across the pavement. Maybe today's the day, she said with a grin. It never was, but that didn't stop us from trying. Daisy lived a few doors down with her dad, a quiet man who always wore a gray baseball cap and smoked endlessly. He rarely spoke, but I'd often catch him sitting outside their room, keeping a watchful eye on the parking lot. One scorching afternoon, my brothers decided to explore the train tracks a few blocks away, leaving me alone outside the motel. Bored and restless, I decided to see if Daisy wanted to play. Her room was at the far end of parking lot, and as I made my way over, I noticed the curtains in her window shift slightly, like someone was peeking out. I stopped, staring at the window. It moved again, a sudden flicker of movement that made my stomach tighten. "Daisy?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The door swung open before I could knock. Standing in the doorway wasn't Daisy. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with matted blonde hair that hung in greasy clumps around her face. Her blue eyes were unnaturally wide, unblinking, and fixed directly on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "I know you," she said, her voice low and raspy. "What?" I asked, taking a step back. "I know who you are," she continued, stepping closer. "You're a star, your destiny. I can show you." The intensity in her gaze pinned me in place. My feet felt rooted to the ground as she took another step toward me, her bony hands outstretched. I think you have the wrong person," I stammered, my voice trembling. "You're special," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "You're a star, your destiny, you have to see." Before I could react, she lunged forward and grabbed my arm. Her grip was iron tight, her nails digging into my skin. "Let me go," I screamed, twisting and pulling against her hold. But she was strong, far stronger than I would have guessed from her thin frame. "You have to come with me," she hissed, dragging me toward the open door behind her. Panic surged through me as I realized she was trying to pull me into the room. I kicked and flailed, desperate to break free. "Help, someone help me," I screamed, hoping anyone would hear. "Stop fighting," she snarled, her face inches from mine. Her breath was sour and sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. "You'll understand once you see, you're meant for this." I dug my heels into the pavement, trying to slow her down, but she was relentless. The rough ground scraped against my legs and stomach as she dragged me closer to the door. "Mom," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "Mom, help!" But no one came. Just as she reached the doorway, a voice boomed from behind us. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The woman froze, her head snapping around. It was Daisy's dad. He was storming across the parking lot, his face twisted in anger. "Let her go," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman's grip loosened just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I stumbled backward, falling hard onto the pavement. "Get inside," Daisy's dad shouted at me. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could back to my family's room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I burst into our room, my mom was lying on the bed watching TV. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up when she saw my tear-streaked face. A woman tried to grab me. I sobbed, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Her expression darkened. She jumped up and stormed out of the room, her fury palpable. When we got back to the parking lot, Daisy's dad was standing outside the woman's room, his arms crossed. "She tried to take my kid." My mom spat, pointing at the woman. "She's not right in the head," Daisy's dad muttered. "I've already called the cops." The woman was sitting on the ground, her wild eyes darting back and forth. "She's a star," she murmured, rocking back and forth. "She's destiny. She has to see." When the police arrived, they handcuffed the woman and led her to their car. She resisted the whole way, thrashing and screaming. "I know you," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You're a star. Your destiny. I can show you." As they shoved her into the back seat, she pressed her face against the window, her unblinking eyes locking onto mine. "You'll see," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the glass. The car drove away, her screams fading into the distance. I found out later that the woman had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility. She was delusional, prone to violent outbursts, and convinced that she could see people's true destinies. Years have passed, but her words still haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice in my head whispering the same chilling phrase. "You're a star. Your destiny." I've always been the quiet type. The kind of guy who doesn't draw much attention, who fades into the background at parties or bars. Not because I want to, but because it's just easier that way. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. If you so much as sneezed, the whole neighborhood would have advice on how to cure it. That's probably why I kept my biggest insecurity to myself. At 24 years old, I was still a virgin. It wasn't for lack of a reason. Okay, maybe it was. But the few times I had the chance, I froze up or made an excuse. It wasn't just the act itself that scared me. It was the vulnerability, the fear of being judged. But after months of feeling like I was falling behind in life, I decided to take control. If I couldn't find intimacy naturally, I'd pay for it. After all, prostitution was legal in my country, and it wasn't like I'd be breaking any laws. I found her online. Elena. She was blonde in her early 20s, and had an approachable smile that made her seem more like the girl next door than someone in the adult industry. Her profile said she was experienced, discreet, and professional. That's all I wanted. Someone who wouldn't judge me. Someone who could make this experience less terrifying. I messaged her late one night, my heart pounding as I typed. The conversation was short and professional. We agreed on a time, a place, and a price. She asked for half the payment up front, which I transferred through an app. It felt risky, but her reviews on the site were glowing. "I'll send you the exact address an hour before," she texted. That part seemed odd, but I convinced myself it was for her safety. If she gave her address to every guy ahead of time, who knew what kind of trouble she might attract? I marked the day on my calendar and spent the next few nights oscillating between excitement and dread. Was I really going to do this? When the day came, I took the train to the city, a 2-hour ride from my small, semi-rural town. The city was overwhelming, loud, crowded, and buzzing with energy. It was the kind of place where no one cared who you were or what you were doing. That anonymity should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I had arrived early and wandered aimlessly, trying to keep my nerves in check. The clock seemed to move at half speed. By the time I texted Elena for the address, my phone battery was at 20%. Back alley off 12th Street. Motel behind the pharmacy. Room 2, her reply read. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Something about it felt off. But I was already here. Turning back now would feel like admitting defeat. The motel was exactly what you'd expect from a place hidden in an alley. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. It didn't look like the kind of place people came to voluntarily. I texted Elena again, letting her know I'd arrived. Her response came almost immediately. "Go inside, ask for a room. It's included in the price." My palms were sweating as I pushed open the glass door. The lobby was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. Behind the counter stood a scrawny man with sunken eyes. "You here for a room?" he asked, his voice raspy. Yeah," I stammered. "Room 2, I think." He raised an eyebrow, a thin smile spreading across his face. Sure. You're all set. Go on up." The staircase was narrow and creaked with every step. As I reached the second floor, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. If all the rooms were occupied, as the clerk had suggested, where were the sounds of TVs, conversations, or footsteps? Room 2 was at the end of the hall. I stood outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob. My phone buzzed. "Come in." Elena had texted. I knocked softly. No answer. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps and the faint click of a lock being undone. The door opened slowly and I froze. The woman standing in front of me wasn't Elena. She was older, at least 50, with leathery skin and lifeless eyes. Her dress was ill-fitting, and her smile was more unsettling than welcoming. "You're Elena?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, just stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. Against every instinct screaming at me, I stepped inside. The room was bare, with a single bed and a faint smell of bleach. The woman closed the door behind me and stood there, watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. "Listen, I think there's been a mistake," I said, backing toward the door. "No mistake," she replied, her voice flat. "You pay. You stay." My heart was pounding. "I need to grab something for my car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be right back." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. I practically ran out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. When I reached the lobby, the clerk was waiting, leaning casually against the counter. "Everything okay up there?" he asked, his tone too casual. "Yeah, fine," I lied, pushing past him and out the door. As I walked away, my phone buzzed. It was Elena. "This isn't you. I'm not paying for this. I'm leaving," I texted. No reply. I turned a corner and stopped, leaning against a wall to catch my breath. That's when I saw him, the scrawny clerk, leading a young girl into the motel. She looked no older than 15. My stomach churned as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a scam. This was something far darker. I reported the address to the local police that night, detailing everything I'd seen. Weeks later, I saw a news article about a raid at the motel. It confirmed what I already suspected: trafficking, exploitation, and a network of lies. Months later, I received a text from an unknown number. "Missed you that day. Room 2 is waiting." I've always prided myself on being a cautious woman. The kind who double-checks door locks, walks briskly through parking lots, and keeps her phone at the ready. My friends joke that I'm paranoid, but I call it being prepared. So you can imagine my shock when I let my guard down during a business trip last week. And it nearly cost me more than just my peace of mind. I was staying at an Embassy Suites in Phoenix, a hotel I'd used for years without a single issue. The kind of place that felt like a second home. Clean rooms, friendly staff, and reliable service. But that familiarity lulled me into a false sense of security, and I didn't see the danger until it was too late. It started at 6:45 a.m. on a Wednesday. The hotel room phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet hum of the TV. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, halfway through my first cup of coffee and catching up on emails. I frowned at the phone. Who calls a hotel room this early? "Hello," I said, picking up. A man's voice answered, warm and disarming. "Hi, is this Rachel?" I froze for a second. Rachel was my name, but I hadn't told anyone I was staying here. Yes, who's this?" "Rachel? Wow, it's been forever." "You won't believe who this is," he said, his tone playful, almost teasing. The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine, but I told myself I was overreacting. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a laugh. "You've got me at a disadvantage." "Who is this?" "Ah, you're killing me," he said with a chuckle. "Okay, let's make it fun. Think of a city, a place you went, had a great time, maybe got a little wild. Come on, take a guess." I hesitated. The phone pressed tightly against my ear. My mind raced. This had to be a prank, right? But he sounded so confident, so sure he knew me. "I don't know. New Orleans?" I guessed, thinking of a trip I'd taken years ago. "Close, but no." "Try again," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Think Midwest." "Cleveland?" I said, more uncertain now. I had been to Cleveland once, for a work conference, but it had been uneventful. "Bingo, Cleveland it is," he said, laughing. "Man, we had some good times there, didn't we?" I stiffened. "I think you've got the wrong Rachel," I said firmly. "I don't remember meeting anyone in Cleveland." There was a pause, just long enough to make me uneasy. Then he spoke again, his tone still light, but with an edge I hadn't noticed before. "Wait, this isn't Rachel Parker." "No," I said quickly. "Wrong person." He let out a low whistle. "Wow, I'm so sorry, what are the odds? I must have gotten the wrong room number." I exhaled, relieved. "No problem. Have a good day." "Wait," he said before I could hang up. "You sound really nice. And since I'll never meet you in person, let me ask, are you as pretty as you sound?" I froze, my stomach twisting. His tone was still friendly, but his words sent a chill down my spine. "Excuse me?" "Relax," he said, laughing softly. "Just making conversation, no harm in a little compliment, right?" I forced myself to stay calm. "Look, I'm not interested in continuing this conversation. Goodbye." All right, he said, his voice smooth as ever. "But hey, you have a great voice. Hope the rest of your day is as beautiful as you are." I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. Who was he? And how had he known my name? I couldn't shake the unease as I got ready for my morning meeting. The man's voice lingered in my mind, along with the way he'd so casually flirted after claiming he had the wrong number. Something about it didn't sit right with me. When I reached the lobby, I approached the front desk. A young man in a wrinkled uniform greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" "Hi," I said, leaning in closer. "I got a strange call in my room this morning. A man who knew my name, first name only. Do you know how that could have happened?" He frowned. "We don't usually connect outside calls directly to guest rooms without confirming the full name." "Did he ask for you by your full name?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "Just Rachel. But he claimed he was looking for someone else." "Rachel Parker." The man's frown deepened. "That's odd. Let me check the call logs for you." He tapped on the computer for a few minutes before looking up with an apologetic smile. "I don't see anything unusual. It could have been a prank call." I nodded, but his explanation didn't ease my mind. "Okay, thanks." As I turned to leave, another woman approached the desk. She looked flustered, her hair still damp from the shower. "Did someone call your room asking for Rachel Parker?" She asked me. I stared at her, my pulse quickening. Number he called asking for Rachel, but he said Parker later. Her face went pale. He called my room too. Asked for Sarah Miller. He said he had the wrong number, but we exchanged a look. The kind that didn't need words. Something was very, very wrong. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle in the room made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man on the phone was still out there, watching, waiting. The next morning I packed my bags and checked out of the hotel early. As I drove to the airport, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see a car following me. I tried to tell myself it was over, that it had just been a weird prank call, but deep down I knew better. 2 days later I was home, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen, before finally answering. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. There was a long pause, then the same smooth voice from the hotel replied, "Rachel, we're not done yet." The line went dead. That call haunted me for days. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable. Every creak in my house made me jump, every shadow seemed menacing. I checked my doors and windows obsessively, telling myself it was all just a stupid prank, but deep down I knew better. A week later, at exactly 10 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, the screen displayed unknown caller. My heart started racing. My hands trembled as I debated whether to answer or let it ring. I wanted to ignore it, but fear and curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone and held it to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice barely steady. There was silence on the other end. Not the kind of silence where someone's about to speak, but a heavy, oppressive stillness. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. "Rachel," the voice said, smooth and familiar. "You thought I'd forget about you?" It was him. The same calm, unnervingly charming voice from the hotel. I gripped the phone tighter, forcing myself to sound firm. "Who are you? What do you want?" He laughed softly, the sound low and unsettling. "Oh, come on. We had such a good chat last time. I thought you'd be happy to hear from me." My blood ran cold. "How did you get this number?" "I told you," he said casually. "I know you. I always know where to find you." I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Before I could speak, he said one last thing that made my knees nearly give out. "By the way, your curtains look lovely tonight. Red suits you." My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor as I spun around to look at my living room window. The curtains were drawn shut, but my fear told me he was out there watching. I didn't sleep that night. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. No caller ID, no proof, just my word and the knowledge that whoever this man was, he wasn't done with me yet. Denver's summer heat pressed against the city, the kind that makes the air shimmer over asphalt. My mom Amanda had decided we'd stay at the Grandview Hotel, a mid-range spot downtown, rather than crashing with our extended family. "We need our space," she had said, and honestly I was glad. I was 12 at the time, just old enough to resent babysitting my younger brother, 6-year-old Lucas, but being the eldest meant the job always fell to me. As Mom approached the front desk to check us in, Lucas and I plopped down on one of the long, plush couches in the lobby. The place was fancy enough to have a chandelier, but not so fancy that I felt out of place in my sneakers and faded t-shirt. "Stay here and don't move," Mom said over her shoulder. Lucas kicked his feet against the couch, humming a tune from one of his favorite cartoons. I let my head fall back, tired from the drive. That's when the glass doors slid open, and he walked in. The man was in his mid-40s, wearing a plain gray shirt and dark jeans. His face was unremarkable, average height, average build, with sandy brown hair combed back neatly. If someone asked me to describe him, I'd struggle. He was that kind of ordinary, but something about him made me pause. He walked past the counter without glancing at the receptionist, and sat on the couch directly across from us. His movements were calm, calculated, like he had all the time in the world. "Who's that?" Lucas asked, his voice low. "No idea," I muttered, trying not to stare. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The man didn't have luggage, he didn't check in, he just sat there, watching the room like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Before I could think too hard about it, Mom called out, "Kids, let's go." I grabbed Lucas' hand, and we hurried to the elevators. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the man. He was still sitting there, eyes flickering to the elevator as if memorizing the floor we were headed to. The rest of the day was a blur of family visits and forced small talk. By the time we returned to the hotel around 7, p.m., I had almost forgotten about the man in the lobby. Almost. Want to swim for a bit before bed? Mom asked as we reached our room on the 3rd floor. Yes. Lucas practically shouted, already pulling his shirt off. I nodded. Swimming sounded like a perfect way to end the night. We changed into our suits, grabbed towels, and headed to the pool. It was a small indoor space on the 1st floor, with warm, humid air that smelled faintly of chlorine. For a while, it was just us. Lucas splashed around in the shallow, and while I floated lazily on my back. Mom sat on one of the lounge chairs, scrolling through her phone. And then he walked in. The man from the lobby. He wasn't wearing swim trunks. Instead, he had on dark jeans and a navy sweater. Way too warm for the summer evening. He sat down in a chair near the pool's entrance, crossing his legs and leaning back like he owned the place. Mom, I whispered, swimming closer to her. It's him. Her eyes snapped up from her phone, locking onto the man. Her jaw tightened. We're leaving in 5 minutes, she said, her voice low but firm. Lucas, oblivious, kept splashing. I'm not done, he whined, when Mom stood and began gathering our things. You're done now, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The man watched us as we left. He didn't say anything, but his gaze followed us out of the room. My heart was pounding by the time we reached the elevator. Back in our room, we tried to settle down. Mom had rented a movie, an old action flick she thought we'd all enjoy, but I could tell she was still uneasy. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the door or check the locks. Why was that guy at the pool? I asked quietly. Once Lucas was distracted by the TV. I don't know, Mom admitted, her voice tight. But if I see him again, we're calling security. Halfway through the movie, Mom got up to take a shower. I stayed on the bed with Lucas, trying to focus on the screen. That's when the knock came. Knock knock. Housekeeping, a high-pitched voice called. I frowned. It was almost 9 p.m. Why would housekeeping come this late? We don't need anything, I called back. But the knock came again, more insistent. Housekeeping, the voice repeated. Lucas looked up from the TV, his eyes wide. Do you think they have candy? I rolled my eyes. No, dummy. Against my better judgment, I got up and opened the door. It was him. The man from the lobby. The man from the pool. He stood there, smiling like we were old friends. How was your swim? He asked casually. For a moment, I couldn't move. My stomach dropped, and my legs felt like jelly. All the worst possibilities flashed through my mind. Kidnapping. Torture. Worse. Before I could slam the door, Mom's voice rang out. Who's that? She called from the bathroom. The man's smile faltered. He glanced past me, likely hearing her footsteps approaching. Have a good night, he said quickly, backing away. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as Mom appeared, her hair wet and a towel wrapped around her. What the hell happened? She demanded. It was him, I stammered. The guy from the pool. He said he was housekeeping. Mom's face went pale. She grabbed the phone and called the front desk. There's a man harassing us, she said sharply. He's pretending to be staff and trying to get into our room. I want security up here right now. I told her we should call the police, but she shook her head. Let's see what security does first. Minutes later, we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Peeking through the peephole, I saw the man walking quickly toward the elevators, his head down. A security guard appeared shortly after, looking annoyed rather than concerned. We didn't find anyone, he said after Mom explained what happened. But we'll keep an eye out. That's not good enough, Mom snapped. I want to switch rooms. The hotel moved us to the 5th floor, far from our original room. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done with us. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next morning we checked out early. Mom said it was because she didn't want to deal with traffic, but I knew the real reason. The man wasn't at the lobby when we left, but I couldn't help scanning every face we passed just in case. Years later I still think about that trip to Denver. Who was that man? What did he want? And what would have happened if Mom hadn't been there to slam the door? I'll never know, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the man in the lobby. It was just past midnight when the hammering on my door started. I jolted awake, heart thudding in my chest as the sound echoed through my apartment. It wasn't the kind of polite knock you'd expect from a neighbor. It was frantic, desperate, almost violent. I sat up in bed trying to shake off the grogginess and instinctively reached for the baseball bat I kept tucked beneath my bed frame. Living alone in a downtown Detroit apartment wasn't the safest choice, but it was what I could afford. I'd never had a break-in or anything like that, but you hear stories. My first thought was that someone was trying to rob me or worse. As I crept toward the door, the hammering got louder, followed by a woman's muffled voice. "Please open up, please." My pulse raced. I wasn't about to open the door without knowing who was on the other side, so I pressed my eye to the peephole. That's when I saw her. Chelsea, my neighbor from 2 doors down, stood in the dimly lit hallway. Her blonde hair was tangled, her oversized t-shirt was soaked in blood, and her face was a mess of bruises and cuts. She looked over her shoulder like someone was chasing her, then leaned close to the peephole. "Luke, please," she whispered urgently. "Let me in, he's going to kill me." I hesitated. Chelsea and I had exchanged polite nods in the hallway a few times, but we weren't exactly friends. Still, seeing her like that, panicked and covered in blood, I couldn't just leave her out there. "Who's trying to kill you?" I asked through the door, gripping the bat tightly. "My boyfriend," she hissed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I'll explain everything, but you've got to let me in before he finds me." I glanced down the hallway through the peephole. It was empty. After a moment's hesitation, I unlocked the door and stepped back. Chelsea stumbled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind her. She leaned against it, breathing heavily, as if she'd been running for her life. "Jesus, Chelsea," I said, staring at her. "What the hell happened?" She shook her head, wiping at her bloody face with trembling hands. "There's no time," she said. "We've got to get out of here. If he finds me here, he'll kill us both." Her words sent a cold chill down my spine. I glanced toward the window, half expecting some crazed man to come charging in. Okay, I said, grabbing my car keys from the counter. "Let's go." We made our way down the stairs as quietly as we could, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chelsea kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at every sound. When we reached my car, I unlocked it and ushered her into the passenger seat. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Where are we going?" I asked as we sped down the empty streets. Just drive," she said, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out." "That's not exactly helpful," I muttered. "Do you have family nearby? Friends?" She shook her head. "Number. The best thing to do is find a motel. I'll call the cops from there." A motel didn't seem like the safest option, but I didn't have a better plan. I drove us to a small rundown place about 10 minutes away. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Inside, the night clerk gave us a wary look, his eyes lingering on Chelsea's bloodied appearance. "Rough night?" he asked, sliding a key across the counter. "You could say that," I replied. "We're calling the cops, don't worry." Once we were in the room, Chelsea collapsed onto the bed and let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "You probably saved my life." "Let's just focus on getting you safe," I said. "Did you call the cops?" "Yeah," she said, holding up her phone. "They'll be here soon." "Good." I grabbed the ice bucket. "I'll get you some ice for your face." When I returned, Chelsea was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. She took the ice pack without a word and pressed it to her swollen lip. Then out of nowhere, she burst into tears. "It's okay," I said awkwardly, sitting down across from her. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you here." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've been trying to leave him for months," she said, "but every time I tried he'd convince me to stay. Tonight I finally got the courage to leave. I was packing a bag when he walked in. He just snapped. I felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "What a piece of shit," I said. "Guys like that deserve to rot in jail." As the hours ticked by, my initial sympathy for Chelsea started to waver. For one thing, the cops hadn't shown up yet, and she didn't seem particularly concerned about it. When I suggested she call them back, she brushed it off. "They'll come," she said. "We just have to be patient." Her calmness felt off. And then there was the blood. It was everywhere. On her shirt, her hands, even her legs. But the injuries on her face didn't seem bad enough to account for it. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" I asked. She shook her head. "Number. It's all from my face." That didn't sit right with me. The amount of blood on her looked like something out of a horror movie. I started to wonder if there was more to her story than she was letting on. Eventually, I decided to call the cops myself. But as I reached for my phone, Chelsea's demeanor changed in an instant. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Calling 911, I said. "Don't," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Why not?" I asked, my stomach sinking. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached behind her and pulled out a knife, her hand trembling, but her gaze steady. "Just don't." I froze, my mind racing. "Chelsea," I said carefully. "What's going on?" "I can't go to jail," she said, her voice breaking. "I just can't." That's when it hit me. She wasn't the victim. She was the threat. She told me to drive her to the Canadian border, but I knew I couldn't let that happen. Fine, I said, but I need to eat something first. She agreed to let me order food, as long as I didn't leave the room. That's when I came up with a plan. I placed an order on DoorDash and included a note. Help. Call 911. Room 204. She has a knife. When the delivery arrived, the cops played it perfectly. They knocked on the door like they were delivering food, and when Chelsea opened it, they were ready. She didn't stand a chance. It turned out Chelsea had stabbed her boyfriend during an argument and left him for dead. He managed to crawl to another neighbor's apartment for help, and the cops had been searching for her all night. As I gave my statement the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I'd come to becoming her next victim. Was a kid, around 9 or 10, my dad got a really high-paying job that forced us to move from middle-of-nowhere Pennsylvania to Brookmont, Maryland. I say forced, but that's probably not the best way to describe what happened. In reality, my parents were thrilled to make the move. It was a decision they barely thought about. In the span of about a month, we went from this tiny, rundown house in a relatively low-income area to a massive property in one of Maryland's nicest suburbs. You might be wondering how I felt about the whole thing. At that age, I was a pretty antisocial kid and mostly kept to myself, so it's not like I was leaving any lifelong friends behind. I didn't really have any to begin with. Years later, my parents would tell me that the prospect of giving me a fresh start was one of the reasons they were so willing to uproot our entire lives. But that's neither here nor there. The move didn't bother me much, and I was able to adjust pretty quickly. It's not like adjusting was very difficult given the circumstances, though. Like I said, the house was huge, and even my 10-year-old self could pick up on the fact that we wouldn't be struggling to make ends meet anymore. I'm not going to bore you about the pointless details about the inside of the house. I'll only tell you what you need to know. I had 2 older brothers, Sean and Harold. The backyard was easily our favorite part. It had a big plot of twisting hedges that made for perfect games of hide-and-seek, tag, or whatever else we came up with. But the best feature by far was the tree house at the right edge of the property. Each house on the block was separated by a decently large cluster of tall trees, and the tree house was situated directly within that patch. I say tree house, but it was more like a tree castle. It wasn't your dad's run-of-the-mill weekend project. It was massive, spanning 6 or 7 adjacent trees. It had 3 different levels and an actual staircase built into it, not those flimsy planks you're probably used to seeing. It was obvious a professional had built it. For a while, my brothers and I played in the treehouse every day. It was always the highlight of our day. But eventually, my brothers got bored of the treehouse. They were older and in that awful teenage phase where nothing was cool anymore. Eventually, I was the only one who played up there, which kind of sucked. I was really torn up about basically being abandoned up there, but my brothers refused to come back no matter what I said. One day, I climbed up into the treehouse and found a folded piece of paper sitting in the corner. To this day, I still remember the exact words written on that first note. It said, "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I was the happiest kid alive. I assumed it was one of my brothers playing a game with me, so I played along, hoping to reinterest them in the treehouse. There was a stack of paper in the treehouse that hadn't been there before, so I eagerly picked up one of the markers we had in there and wrote back, leaving a little note with my name. I placed it where I had found the first one, excited to play this new game. That night, I wanted to ask my brothers which of them was the Marshmallow Man, but I was afraid they'd stop playing if I said anything, so I kept quiet. For the next few days, I'd come home from school and run straight to the treehouse. Each time, there'd be another note waiting for me. At first, the notes were innocent and sounded exactly like stuff my brothers would say. I was having a lot of fun with it, but as the days went on, the notes got stranger. The Marshmallow Man started asking me increasingly personal questions that I didn't fully understand. Things that didn't make sense for my brothers to ask, like, "What's your favorite time of day to play outside?" Or "What do you usually eat for breakfast?" I don't remember every question he asked, but one of them that will always stick with me was, "Which window in the house is your bedroom?" I look back at that exact question and literally feel sick to my stomach. At the time, I still didn't think too much of it. I assumed it was still one of my brothers, so I answered every question without hesitation. But the next note was so unsettling that I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was something like, "What do your pajamas smell like?" or something nasty along those lines. I stormed inside and confronted my brothers, demanding to know which of them was behind the notes. They both started laughing at me and denied it. Both of them swore there was no such thing as the Marshmallow Man and started making fun of me for still playing make-believe. I started crying and ran out of the room. I remember being a mixture of sad and angry. I knew one of them had to be lying. Instead of going to my parents, I hatched a plan to catch them in the act. I was not prepared for what was about to happen. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard tapping at my window. I froze, feeling my heart start to beat out of my chest. I was already scared of the dark to begin with, so the tapping added a layer of fear that I couldn't deal with. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I pulled back the window curtains and almost screamed. Taped to the outside of my window were dozens of marshmallows. It had to be my brothers. I was so angry this wasn't funny anymore. I decided I'd catch them red-handed the next night. I pretended like I hadn't noticed the marshmallows and didn't say a thing to either of them all day. Later that night, I was ready. When the tapping started again, I jumped out of bed and yanked the curtains open, ready to yell at them. But it wasn't my brothers. On the other side of the glass was a man, an old, disgusting man with yellow eyes and what looked like rotting teeth. He had patchy hair on his head and smiled at me when he noticed me looking. I don't think I've ever screamed louder in my life. I felt like I was going to die in that moment. My parents came running, but by the time they got to my room, the man was gone. It was a huge thing. The police searched the property, combing through every inch of the yard and treehouse, but they didn't find anything. They even checked the surrounding area, but that man was never found. Some of our neighbors came outside to see what was going on and reacted in horror when my parents filled them in. I told the police and my parents everything I knew, but there wasn't much I could even say. They took the notes in as evidence, but I doubt they really did anything with them. That man never came back. My parents told me to never play in the treehouse again, but it's not like I wanted to after that incident anyway. I moved out of that house a while ago, but my parents still live there, and I always take an extra long look at the treehouse whenever I'm back. This remains one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. This memory has been on my mind a lot lately. My youngest son, Luke, just went off to college, and while I'm proud of him, the house feels quieter than it ever has before. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. It's funny, when the kids are young, you dream of peace and quiet, but when it finally comes, it's not as comforting as you thought it would be. I don't know why, but his going away unlocked a part of my brain that honestly forgot about what I'm about to tell you. People have told my wife and I that it's normal to be thinking a little extra about memories from my kid's childhood at a time like this, so I guess it's not too surprising. I still remember when he was just a little kid, full of energy and curiosity, always getting into something. There's one memory I have of that time that is definitely not all sunshine and rainbows, though. Luke was 8 years old when this happened. Even now, I can't fully make sense of it. I'm a carpenter by trade, so I'm pretty good with my hands. Always have been. I will admit that I was much more lively back then, willing to undertake all sorts of makeshift projects and such. One of my favorite projects was the treehouse I built for Luke in the backyard, which is still standing to this day. It wasn't just a simple platform nailed to a tree. I poured my heart into it. Walls, a roof, proper wooden steps leading up to the entrance. It was sturdy too. I wanted it to feel like an extension of our house to him, and I definitely succeeded in that regard. My wife Christy wasn't thrilled about it at first. She worried it was too high off the ground and unsafe, but Luke was the kind of kid who was always climbing trees anyway, and I figured it would be safer to give him a proper ladder rather than let him scramble up branches that could snap. Christy eventually came around, and Luke absolutely loved it. I should probably tell you a little bit about our property so that this story makes more sense. Our house was at the very end of a dead-end street in a relatively woodsy area. The backyard actually bordered the woods, which was part of why Christy and I fell in love with the house in the first place. It was private and peaceful, and we're kind of people that like keeping to ourselves. I still laugh when I think about all the times friends and family members have gotten lost trying to find our house. The yard wasn't huge, but I could clearly see the treehouse from our bedroom window, which was one of the deciding factors when I was determining where to build it. I wanted to be able to keep an eye on it should Luke hurt himself or something like that. I couldn't actually see inside of it because of the walls, but I had a perfect view of the steps leading up to it. From what I remember, everything was relatively normal for a pretty long time. Luke spent what I considered a normal amount of time playing in the treehouse. His older brother had kind of outgrown that phase, so Luke mostly played by himself in there. I can't remember exactly when, but at one point he started talking about an imaginary friend named Jake. We knew it was an imaginary friend because no one in the neighborhood had a child named Jake. It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, but Luke was 8, not exactly the age where you'd still expect that sort of thing. Christy thought it was cute and innocent, but I was a little more skeptical. It seemed odd to me since Luke hadn't been the type of kid to make imaginary friends. Regardless, I didn't think much of it because he was only 8 years old. It started to get a little more concerning when Christy and I realized that Luke was starting to spend more and more time up there. What struck me as strange was that he wasn't bringing toys up there. As far as I could tell, he only had his imagination to play with. It's not like he had a game console or anything to keep him entertained, and I had been very clear about not carrying anything up there alone, as it was dangerous and I didn't want him to fall. At one point, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to ask him about it. Luke acted extremely weird when I asked him about his friend, and said that Jake was shy and didn't like being talked about. When I asked him why he was spending so much time up there, he told me that Jake only liked to play in the treehouse, and that he didn't like coming inside. I honestly didn't know what to say. It seemed like a pretty bizarre condition. Weren't imaginary friends supposed to be available wherever and whenever you needed them? I did some research later that day and found out that some kids only play with their imaginary friends in certain rooms of their house, so as weird as it was, I accepted it. Christy was pretty uneasy though. She thought Luke was taking this imaginary friend thing too far, and I honestly agreed. We weren't helicopter parents, though. When it came to our kids, we let them spend their free time however they wanted to, as long as they were doing well in school and completing their chores. Most weekends, we'd let Luke play with the neighborhood kids until the sun went down. They'd ride bikes, play tag, and usual stuff. They were all good kids, and we trusted Luke to behave himself and stay out of trouble. He wasn't the type of kid to pick on other kids or get into fights, which was why I was especially concerned when Luke came home one Saturday with a black eye. I cleaned him up and asked him what happened. He looked down at the floor and didn't say anything, but I insisted that he tell me what happened and I wouldn't be mad at him. What he said next made me shiver. He looked up at me and told me that he had gotten into a fight with Jake. I had to process whose kid Jake was before realizing that he was talking about his imaginary friend. I told him not to lie to me and that he wasn't being funny. Instead of fessing up, Luke just started crying and ran to his room. Christy was convinced he'd gotten into a fight with one of the neighborhood kids and didn't want to admit it. I agreed with that. She wanted me to take down the treehouse right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. That treehouse had taken weeks of hard work, and the thought of tearing it down didn't sit right with me. I told her that I'd talk with Luke and tell him that he was taking things way too far. Luke refused to come out of his room or talk to me for the rest of the day, so getting something out of him wasn't going to happen. The next day, I decided to investigate. When I climbed up into the treehouse, what I saw made my stomach churn. Scattered around were children's socks and sneakers, all dirty and tattered. I knew for a fact that none of them belonged to Luke. I also knew for a fact that they weren't my older son's either. We had donated all of his old shoes a long time ago. That's not all that was up there. There were also food wrappers, bags, utensils, even a couple of dirty plates. Weirdest of all, there were pencil drawings of wild animals on all the walls. There was a fox, a bear, some deer. I don't remember all of them, but I do remember that they were all animals. The one that stood out to me the most was what appeared to be a gigantic spider with a face that was just completely penciled over. It was just downright freaky. I immediately climbed down and asked Luke about the treehouse. He told me that Jake only liked to talk on a full stomach, so he had to bring him food and other snacks. He then told me that the shoes and socks were also Jake's, and that Jake was pretty forgetful in general. That was it. From that moment on, I forbade Luke from going into the treehouse. I knew he was still lying to me, and I wanted to punish him until he admitted to it. I was 100% sure that Luke had found those things around the neighborhood and was making up stories to cover it up. Christy was worried about Luke's mental health, and I was too. We thought about consulting a professional should things continue, but one evening, I saw something that changed everything. I was looking out the bedroom window when I spotted movement near the treehouse. At first, I was livid that Luke was disobeying me, but then I realized what I was looking at. A sickly, frail-looking child was climbing down the treehouse steps. It wasn't Luke. He didn't look like any of the kids from the neighborhood either. His clothes were dirty, and he moved like he hadn't eaten in days. I ran outside, yelling for that kid to stop. As soon as I opened the back door, the boy darted into the woods. I chased after him, but he was freakishly fast. Within seconds, he disappeared into the trees. Christy called every parent in the neighborhood, but all their kids were accounted for. He called the police, who searched the woods thoroughly for over an hour, but found nothing. No missing children had been reported in the area, either. The whole thing was beyond explanation. With my consent, the police questioned my son about that kid, and what he told them was horrifying. Apparently, Jake claimed to be a magic boy who lived in the woods with his other friends. His friends were supposedly all animals, as he called them bear, fox, and names like that. Every time Jake would come to visit my son, he'd beg him to leave his family behind and join him in the woods with the rest of his friends. He'd then get mad when Luke would refuse and make these strange noises. I don't know why Luke never told me any of it, and there was a part of me that felt responsible for putting him in danger like that. The police conducted a full search of the woods, but never found a thing. We never saw Jake again after that. Christy has always been incredibly superstitious and theorized that Jake wasn't real. I don't believe in stuff like that, but the way she talks about it always gives me an unsettling feeling. I honestly don't know which explanation is freakier, the fact that some paranormal entity was interacting with my son, or the thought that there might be woods folk lurking around somewhere in the forest behind my house. This happened a few weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I live in a quiet suburb in Delaware, but I'm a sophomore in college out in California. This happened during fall break in October, when I was back home for a few days. I come home every chance I can, which honestly always feels a little bittersweet. I love seeing my parents, but they're really traditional, which can be suffocating. One of the things that drives me crazy is how uptight they are about weed. Even though it's recently been legalized here, they'd lose their minds if they knew I smoked. They've never really gotten used to the idea that I'm an adult now. I can't really understand their position on the whole thing, but at the end of the day, they are my parents, and I would never disrespect them, especially while I'm under their roof. Whenever I'm home, I have to sneak around to avoid getting caught. I hate to admit it, but sneaking around my parents is a skill I've mastered over the years. I can't even count the number of times I've snuck out of the house late at night, let alone all the other mischievous shit I used to do. My dad has the nose of a bloodhound, so smoking inside isn't an option. Thankfully, my old treehouse is still standing in the front yard. My parents built it for me when I was a kid, and even though it's weathered and creaky in some spots, it's held up surprisingly well. It's high enough in the trees that it's basically hidden from view, especially from the house. From up there, I can see everything, the yard, the street, some windows of the house, but no one can see me unless they know exactly where to look. When I was younger, that treehouse was the place I went when I needed to escape, which if you knew what I was like as a child, was relatively often. It's honestly kind of hard to talk about with all the old memories flooding back, but I'll get to the point. On the Saturday before I was supposed to fly back to school, my parents were out at some banquet or something that was going to run late into the evening. I knew they wouldn't be home for hours, but I didn't know exactly when they'd be returning. I didn't want to risk getting caught in the backyard, so I climbed up into the treehouse with my stash just to be safe. It was chilly out, and I could see my own breath in the air. I have this theory that cold weather induces more nostalgia, but that might just be me. It was quiet and peaceful up there, and it was nice being the only one around. I've always liked being up high, too, so that definitely added to the experience. I watched the sunset as I thought about school, excited to go back. By the time I finished, it was mostly dark outside, meaning I had timed things just right. That's when I noticed it. As I was panning my eyes across the yard, a light turned on in the house. I froze, knowing I was the only one home. My heart started racing as I stared at the window, feeling that instinctual sense of fear that only arises from true danger. I feel the vision began closing in around that single source of light, as if it were drawing me in. A few moments later, movement in the backyard snapped me out of my disassociative state. 3 hooded figures were circling the property, clearly trying to move quickly. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. I watched as the 3 figures moved to the front steps. That's when a 4th figure opened the door and let them in. My chest tightened as it hit me. My house was being robbed. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't look away. Part of me was still frozen, and another part of me was still trying to convince myself that what I was seeing was real. That's the best way I can explain what I was feeling in that moment. One of the figures stayed outside, pacing the yard. I think some subconscious part of me clicked, because I looked down and my phone was in my hand, open to the keypad on my phone app. Without thinking, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I told the operator what was happening and hung up, but as I was putting my phone away, the light from the screen must have caught the guy's eye, because he whipped his head to look up into the trees. I ducked, but I was worried he had seen me. Not 3 seconds later, I got my answer. I heard a voice yell out, "Hey," clearly directed at me. I peeked around one of the wooden floor pieces, and saw a dark figure walking towards the base of the tree. He knew where I was sure of it. He got to the base of the tree, and started climbing the wooden planks that lead up to the treehouse. I screamed that police were on their way, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't stop. He just kept climbing, his hands gripping the planks like he was determined to get to me. Without thinking, I grabbed my bong, the only thing within reach, and threw it as hard as I could. It hit him in the head, and shattered into a million pieces, and he let out a loud curse before falling to the ground. He wasn't very high up, but it was enough to make him reconsider. Instead of climbing back up again, he ran back towards the house, and shouted at the other guys who were still inside. The next thing I saw was all 4 of them running to my backyard, where they presumably entered and exited from. My heart was still beating like crazy. Not even 3 minutes later, the police arrived. I was shaking so badly as I climbed down from the treehouse that I thought I was going to fall. I tried to tell them what had happened, but my words were a mess. I told them that I hadn't seen a getaway car, and that I didn't get a good look at any of their faces. My parents pulled in not long after that. They were really sympathetic about the whole thing, which I was grateful for. The police told us that the robbers must have known my parents would be out that night. It seemed like a planned job, but what they didn't plan for was me being there. I still don't know how to feel about it. I especially don't want to think about what would have happened had that guy gotten all the way up to the treehouse. I'm back at school now, but if I'm being honest, I haven't had a good night's sleep since this incident. I'm terrified those people might come back, and even more terrified that my parents are there all alone. I'm worried sick about their safety, and I just hope that's the last we ever hear of them. I hope I never have to give an update, but I will if God forbid something comes up. When I was a kid, I had a very nightmarish experience at my childhood home. My family moved to this house when I was like 4, so I really don't remember anything of the house we lived in when I was born. We lived in what I call my childhood house from when I was 4 to when I was 14, so exactly 10 years. I love that house. I have very good memories from growing up there. We moved out of state when I was just beginning high school, which was a nightmare in and of itself, but that's nothing to do with this story. In the backyard of my childhood home was a treehouse. It was built by the previous owner for his kids. Believe it or not, when my parents viewed the house, a major selling point was the kid-friendly nature of the house and the backyard for my older brother and I. My brother Kyle is 2 years older than me, so he was 6 when they bought the house, and my brother and I apparently were very excited over the treehouse aspect in the backyard, according to my parents. My brother and I would play in the treehouse with friends we'd made over the years, but as the years passed, I would stop playing in the treehouse like that at a certain age. By the age of 12, I was obviously not playing in the treehouse anymore, but I was admittedly a troublemaker around this age, and I would often get in trouble with my parents. I'd get grounded often, and in general I'd just throw a lot of temper tantrums, and there would be a lot of yelling in the house. One weekend, my dad grounded me for a repeat complaint from my guidance counselor about my behavior and grades in school, and like an angsty, annoying preteen, I thought I hated my parents at that moment. That night, I refused to sleep in the house. I took a couple blankets and pillows and went outside to the treehouse to sleep up there. It wasn't the first time I'd done this, and my parents would know about it when I'd do it. They didn't care. It was my little way of rebelling. Little did my dad know that I had my Nintendo DS with me, even though I wasn't allowed to play video games or watch TV. I played Animal Crossing for literally hours before getting tired and eventually going to sleep, but I think I was only asleep for a few moments. I don't think I even entered REM sleep yet, when I woke up to a voice from outside calling my name. Tommy, Tommy, Tommy. I was still confused as I was waking back up. It could have been my dad's voice. Tommy, are you up there? The voice said. All I remember is it being a deep, grown man's voice. I didn't reply. My heart started to race for some reason. I heard the steps of the ladder squeaking as someone was coming up, and then in the near pitch-black darkness, I saw someone poke their head through the opening in the floor. I couldn't see their face, I just saw the shadow of the outline of their head. He said, "Ah, there you are." I replied, "Dad?" But this was where he stopped responding entirely. For about 20 seconds, I stared at this head that I presumed was staring back at me. I was waiting for my eyes to readjust to the darkness, but something told me that wasn't my dad. I stood up and went to the window of the treehouse and started screaming Dad as loud as I could. I saw the light in my parents' room turn on, and I also heard footsteps hurrying down the ladder to the treehouse. Moments later, my parents burst outside through the back door, and my dad swore to me that he wasn't out there playing a prank on me. My parents believed me. It wasn't like some stupid horror movie where the parents don't believe a word the kid says. My uncle was still an active cop at the time, and so my dad called him for advice, and my uncle made a report on the incident the next day. Not much information I could give besides I heard a deep man's voice and saw the outline of his head, and that he knew my name. Not much the police could work with. Obviously, I never spent a night in the treehouse again. My dad for a while thought it was one of the neighbors directly across from us, but he could never prove it. For years, whenever I'd see him outside and he'd say hi to me, I'd try to think back to the voice from that night, but I just couldn't remember it clearly enough to make a comparison. It still remains a very unsettling mystery in the back of my mind.